Whether you're here to drift off into dreams or just letting this play softly in the background while you do something else, I'm glad you're here. Before we drift into history, tell me in the comments, if you could visit one ancient city, which would it be? The fire had gone out. Rome at last was quiet. The smoke that once drifted from Caesar's funeral pyre had vanished into the hills. The smell of resin and ash had long since faded, and in its place came the ordinary scent of the city again. Bread baking in the ovens, dust rising from the forum, olive oil and iron, sweat and sunlight. The storms of revolution had passed, but Rome was not healed. It was merely still. In the markets, people spoke in softer tones. Every conversation seemed to begin with a glance over the shoulder. It was as though the city itself had grown cautious, the way a soldier grows quiet after too many campaigns, moving gently so that his wounds do not reopen. The statues of the old republic still stood, but the marble looked older now. Some were chipped by stones thrown in riots, some darkened by smoke. Even the gods seemed weary. The Senate met again in its chamber, but the voices that once thundered through its marble halls now carried the brittle sound of habit, men talking because they no longer knew what else to do. The Republic was alive in form, but hollow in spirit. Its words remained, but their meaning had wandered. Into this silence stepped a young man, thin, watchful, composed beyond his years. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's heir, barely 20, he had seen more blood in 5 years than most men saw in a lifetime. He had outlived conspirators, generals, and orators. He had learned that in Rome, patience was sharper than any sword. He had been Caesar's adopted son, but not his copy. Where Caesar had been a storm, Octavian was a tide, slow, steady, inevitable. He looked upon the city not with sorrow, but with calculation. Where others saw ruins, he saw a foundation. Where others saw exhaustion, he saw readiness. For the first time in living memory, Rome wanted calm, and Octavian would give it, not as mercy, but as a method. He moved carefully through the corridors of power, listening more than he spoke. He let senators believe they were guiding him. He let generals think they commanded him. He let the people imagine they had chosen him. In truth, he was learning how to build an empire without ever declaring one. The years that followed Caesar's death had drained the city. Famine, assassinations, revenge lists, prescriptions, each left scars that even time could not hide. Whole families were gone. The forum had lost its laughter. Even the festivals felt uneasy, as though the gods themselves were listening for the next upheaval. Men had learned to fear victory because victory always belonged to someone else. No one trusted triumph anymore. Rome was ready for peace, but no one dared say the word aloud. Octavian understood that silence. He understood that a city cannot be ruled by ideals when it is tired. It must be ruled by rhythm, by the steady, careful repetition of small mercies. So he began to repair what he could. He reopened the grain routes from Africa, ordered the aqueducts maintained, and restored the temples that had been closed during the wars. He decreed new festivals, not to celebrate conquest, but to remind people what ordinary joy felt like. The city began, slowly, to breathe again. He was everywhere and nowhere. Octavian did not shout like Antony, nor demand loyalty through spectacle. He spoke quietly, delegated often, and let his name circulate in whispers rather than proclamations. He had seen what happened when one man's face filled every statue, when crowds shouted one name until fear replaced love. He would not repeat that mistake. Instead, he practiced absence. He allowed Rome to see what it wanted to see. A Senate debating freely, laws passed through old traditions, offices filled by election. He even let Antony believe he still shared power. He called him friend, raised toasts in his name, and smiled through a clenched calculation. But while Antony courted glory, Octavian courted time. He studied the city like an artist preparing a canvas, measuring what could be erased and what must be left untouched. He knew that too much change too soon would shatter the illusion. An illusion, to Octavian, was the first tool of peace. In the early mornings before dawn, the city felt different. The night guards drowsed in their stations. Bakers carried baskets of bread through empty streets. Smoke rose thinly from the baths as attendants lit the fires. Octavian sometimes walked then with a small escort but little ceremony. He would stop in the forum, look up at the statues of men who had come before, and study their faces. Cato, Cicero, Pompey, Caesar, Each had tried to save Rome in his own way, and each had been devoured by it. He wondered what they would make of him, this quiet young man who spoke of order rather than freedom, and who seemed to believe that peace could be built from obedience. He wondered, too, whether they would recognize what he was really doing. Octavian was not restoring the Republic. He was embalming it, preserving its form, hollowing its heart, and filling it with his own pulse. At first, it was only a phrase. A poet in some speech said that Octavian's rule had the calm of empire. The word lingered. It spread from tavern to tavern, from soldier to merchant, from the Senate to the street. Empire, imperium. It sounded steady, permanent, safe. People liked the sound of it. It promised structure after chaos, continuity after grief. And so, without decree or proclamation, Rome began to think of itself not as a republic, but as something new. A civilization that ruled because it existed, and existed because it ruled. Octavian did not invent that idea. He simply allowed it to name itself. When the Senate at last offered him a title, Augustus, it came wrapped in ceremony, spoken in tones of reverence rather than fear. The name meant the revered one. It carried the flavor of sanctity, the softness of approval rather than command. Octavian accepted it as if surprised, though he had arranged every step that led to it. He thanked the Senate humbly, promised to protect the Republic, and bowed before the gods. The city erupted in celebration. Trumpets, garlands, feasts, poems. People shouted his name as if calling on a blessing. And that night, from his balcony, Augustus looked out over the lights of the city, listening to the echo of their joy. He knew it for what it was, not worship, not gratitude, but relief. Relief that the storms were over. Relief that someone finally was strong enough to let them rest. Under that relief, something miraculous began to grow. For the first time in generations, children were born into peace. The legions no longer marched against Romans, but against distance itself, building roads, guarding frontiers, planting flags in far horizons that had never heard the name of Rome. The markets filled again. The baths were rebuilt. Artists and philosophers returned to the city. Coins gleamed fresh with new minting. On one side, the image of Augustus, on the other, the goddess of peace. And though the marble shone bright under the sun, the true brilliance of Rome now lay in the quiet, in the hum of ordinary life restored, in the steady rhythm of the empire discovering how to be calm. Augustus had achieved what no conqueror before him had managed, to make stillness feel like destiny. Rome had known rulers before. Kings, consuls, dictators, generals, each had risen with promise and fallen with warning. But what Augustus built was different. He did not simply rule, he redesigned what ruling meant. He understood what Caesar never had, that power survives best when it looks like service. That control is strongest when it feels like continuity. So he began not with armies, but with language, the language of restoration. Every decree he issued began with the same word, restituit. He was restored. He restored temples. He restored laws. He restored faith, trade, peace, dignity. Each proclamation spoke of renewal, but beneath every restoration was a quiet invention. When he restored the Senate, he reduced its numbers, filled it with men whose loyalty leaned toward gratitude, and positioned himself not above it, but within it, the first among equals. It sounded modest. It was genius. When he restored the people's assemblies, he made sure they met only to confirm decisions already shaped by his hand. And when he restored religion, he rebuilt the old shrines, but placed his own family at the center of Rome's sacred memory. He called this pietas, devotion. And devotion in Rome was law. Augustus never called himself king. He didn't need to. The word was poison in Roman ears, a reminder of Tarquin the Proud. The last monarch was expelled 500 years before. Instead, he accepted titles that sounded like duties. Princeps, the first citizen. Imperator, the commander. Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. Each name is modest in isolation. Together they formed an architecture of control so elegant that no one saw it forming until it was complete. He wore no crown. He needed none. Rome itself became his regalia. In those early years, Rome began to hum with a new rhythm. Offices that had once been chaotic became predictable. Governors now send regular reports to the capital. Tax collectors were supervised, roads inspected, grain weighed and tallied. Augustus made bureaucracy an art form. The empire became a living organism, arteries of stone and water, nerves of law and message, muscle in its legions, mind in its administration. He could stand on the Palatine Hill and know, within days, what was happening at the edges of Spain or Syria. No tyrant had ever possessed such reach. But Augustus didn't command through fear. He commanded through expectation. He made Rome's peace feel inevitable. Its order is self-sustaining. And that, perhaps, was his greatest illusion. Every session of the Senate still opened with a ceremony. The elders arrived in white togas, their sandals squeaking faintly on marble floors. They sat, they debated, they gestured. Their words echoed beautifully but harmlessly. When they passed laws, they thanked Augustus for the opportunity. When they argued, they did so within boundaries he himself had set. It was governance as theater, politics as reassurance. The Senate still acted as the conscience of Rome, but its heartbeat now matched his. And Augustus was content with that. He did not want to destroy the Republic's symbols. He wanted them to glow quietly under his light, like stars still visible beside a rising sun. Augustus knew that cities survive on structure, but people survive on story. So he turned his attention to belief, not only in gods but in meaning itself. The civil wars had left Rome spiritually adrift. The old rituals had grown thin, priests corrupted, omens ignored. He reversed that, not by preaching, but by participating. He was seen at every sacrifice. He restored the Vestal Virgin's temple. He walked in the great processions. He spoke often of fate, not destiny as arrogance, but destiny as duty. He wanted Rome to see piety not as superstition, but as stability. To believe that the gods themselves approved of order. In doing so, he aligned heaven with hierarchy. Faith became a civic act, and Rome's conscience was reborn, tethered gently to his name. Among the crowds, Augustus was loved differently than Caesar. Caesar had been adored like a hero, with wild cheers and dangerous intimacy. Augustus was loved like weather, quietly, constantly, as something always present and taken for granted. He appeared in public rarely, and when he did, he dressed simply, spoke softly, and let the people come close enough to feel gratitude, but not ownership. He knew how quickly adoration becomes hunger. He preferred reverence, a calmer emotion, a longer-lasting one. He organized grain distributions, rebuilt the theaters, and sponsored games that felt less like indulgence and more like a ritual. He even repaired the city's drains, a detail that seemed small, but meant everything to those who lived above them. He gave Rome not splendor, but comfort. And comfort, once achieved, is rarely surrendered. What he built stretched beyond marble and memory. He reorganized provinces into two categories, those governed by the Senate and those governed by himself. On parchment, it looked balanced. In practice, his territories held the armies. It was the cleanest sleight of hand in history. Rome could say the Republic still existed, and Augustus could ensure it did, under him. He reformed taxation, introduced a census, regulated marriage, and punished corruption with precision rather than spectacle. Every new law was described not as innovation, but as a restoration. And so, with every gentle correction, he pushed Rome further from what it had been and closer to what it would always become. The arts flourished again. Painters, sculptors, poets, each found in his reign both patron and purpose. Horace wrote of virtue and moderation. Virgil began his Aeneid, a story that mirrored Augustus himself, a wanderer who founded peace by accepting destiny. Rome, rebuilt in marble, felt younger than it had in a century, but its youth was planned, its spontaneity was scheduled. Even beauty, under Augustus, had a timetable. He believed that art should teach stability, that beauty should reassure, not provoke. And so, even as statues rose, they all seemed to smile the same measured smile. Even as poems were recited, they all ended in the same quiet faith, that Rome would last forever, because it was already perfect. Perfection, though, is heavy. It does not breathe easily. As the years passed, Augustus began to feel that weight. The peace he had built was vast but delicate, a glass dome stretched across continents. He could not let it crack. He grew cautious of illness, of signs and omens. He traveled with doctors and augurs, avoiding anything that might unsettle the balance he had created. Even in his private letters, he wrote in measured tones. He confessed affection, but never indulgence. He spoke of policy as if it were prayer. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk the palace halls, listening to the soft echo of his own footsteps, and wonder if this was what Caesar had dreamed of, a world so orderly that even silence had protocol. By the time he reached middle age, Augustus was less a man than an atmosphere. His face appeared on coins, his initials on milestones, his presence in every law, his absence is unthinkable. Children who had never known civil war grew up calling him father. Foreign kings wrote to him as if to a god. Rome had finally achieved what every empire longs for, not just obedience, but belief. And in that belief, Augustus found the one thing Caesar never had: time enough to finish his dream. The Republic was gone, yet no one mourned it. The empire was here, yet no one feared it. And so Rome slept, content, prosperous, unaware that history for the first time had stopped moving. From the outside, his home on the Palatine Hill looked modest. It was not the largest, nor the most ornate. The marble of his residence gleamed softly in the morning sun, but beside the palaces of senators and generals, it seemed almost restrained. That restraint was deliberate. Augustus had learned long ago that opulence invites envy. He wanted admiration, not resentment, so even his walls whispered humility. Inside, though, the air was heavy with silence, a cultivated, disciplined quiet, the sort of silence that comes not from peace but from control. The house was filled with servants, scribes, secretaries, guards, priests attending to the household gods. Yet wherever Augustus walked, people stepped aside with eyes lowered, as if he were passing through a temple rather than a home. He was kind to his staff, but distant. He spoke softly, rarely raised his voice, and never forgot a name. It was part of his design, a ruler who remembered, who noticed, who made attentiveness look like mercy. But even mercy, in time, becomes theater. And within those walls, behind closed doors, the man who ruled the known world sometimes seemed smaller than his shadow. At his side stood Livia Drusilla, poised, intelligent, unflinching. She was the one person who could interrupt him mid-thought without apology. He trusted her judgment, admired her discipline, and relied on her in ways the Senate could never imagine. Their marriage was not one of romance. It was an alliance of minds. Livia understood power the way others understood poetry. She could read the mood of a crowd from a single cheer, sense danger from a silence in a room. Together they became the still center of a turning world. She maintained the image of the perfect Roman matron, modest in dress, devoted to her household gods, serene in public. But behind that serenity, she advised, calculated, corrected. There was not a law, a decree, a whisper of succession that did not, at some point, pass through her careful hands. Augustus had no sons of his own blood. Fate, as if to remind him of his humanity, had denied him heirs. But Rome could not live without an heir. He adopted, he arranged marriages, he tested loyalty like an artist testing pigment. First came Marcellus, his nephew, young, beautiful, beloved. Rome adored him. Then Marcellus died suddenly, and the city mourned as if it had lost its future. Next came Agrippa, his general and oldest friend, the man who had built his victories into an empire. Agrippa married into the family, became both ally and successor. But time again refused obedience. Agrippa too was taken. Then came the grandsons, Gaius and Lucius. He raised them with care, trained them for command, watched them step into their roles like actors in a play written for them. But destiny is cruel even to those who shape it. Both died before they could rule. Each funeral felt like a shadow stretching across the marble of his reign. Rome still saw peace. Augustus saw ghosts. In the afternoons when business was done, he would walk through the colonnades of his gardens. The air smelled of pine and myrtle. He would stop to watch bees move among the flowers. Sometimes he spoke to Livia in short phrases, never in speeches. They discussed family, health, omens, but always with the undercurrent of politics. Every illness was a potential crisis, every dream a symbol to interpret. To outsiders it looked like harmony. To those within the household, it was vigilance. No dynasty, however calm, can truly rest. Augustus had made morality a law. He revived old customs, enforced strict marriage rules, exiled men and women who broke them. Even his own daughter, Julia, was banished for her scandalous affairs. Rome admired his firmness, but whispered about his heart. They said the emperor who could govern the world could not govern his own family. He said nothing in reply. He rarely did. But those closest to him noticed a quiet sadness that followed him in the evenings, a weight that had nothing to do with policy. He would sit by a lamp in his study, hands folded, and stare at the flame as though reading a memory in it. He had made Rome perfect on the outside. Inside, perfection had become a prison. His days followed an almost sacred pattern. He rose before dawn, read reports from governors, listened to petitions, and dictated letters in his precise, economical Latin. He ate little, mostly bread, cheese, figs, and a bit of fish. He preferred conversation to banquets, reading to revelry. Even his leisure had purpose. He played dice occasionally, but only for small stakes. He quoted old proverbs to his servants. He corrected them gently when they forgot. He moved through life like a man rehearsing eternity. The poets called him serene. His physician called him sleepless. In his private chambers hung a bust of Julius Caesar, not grand, not gilded, just marble, worn smooth by years of polishing. Augustus never removed it. He would touch it before major decisions, a habit that blended piety and superstition. He did not worship the man. He studied him. Caesar had taught him what to do and what never to repeat. When Augustus looked at that marble face, he saw both warning and inheritance. He saw the fire that had built him and the blade that had nearly destroyed him. In the glow of the lamplight, the bust sometimes seemed to breathe. Perhaps that was the secret of Rome, that its ghosts never left, only changed their names. As dusk settled over the Palatine, lamps were lit one by one. The sound of sandals softened. From the kitchens came the faint clink of pottery. Outside, the voices of children drifted from nearby courtyards. Livia would sometimes sit beside him in silence, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. They would watch the last light fade across the rooftops. In those quiet moments, the empire seemed far away, a dream belonging to someone else. He would speak then, not as emperor, but as a man. "Do you think," he once asked, "that peace can ever be loved for itself, or only for what it spares us from?" Livia did not answer immediately. When she did, she said, "It depends on whether the world remembers what it cost to earn it." He smiled faintly. It was the closest thing to philosophy he allowed himself. In time, the house became a shrine. Every visitor entered softly, as though entering history. They said his presence made even the air behave. He rarely spoke of death, but he prepared for it constantly, updating his will, arranging his tomb, selecting the words that would one day be carved into stone. He left nothing to chance, not even memory. And yet, even with all his control, there were moments when he would stand by a window, look out over the city he had rebuilt, and simply listen to the hum of voices, to the rhythm of a life greater than any decree. It was in those moments, perhaps, that he understood what Caesar never had, that empire was not built from conquest, but from the patience to make peace feel eternal. Outside, the city glittered with lamps. Merchants closed their stalls. Children ran through the streets carrying torches made of reeds. The night guards took their posts. Above them all, the palace windows glowed faintly. Behind those windows, the emperor wrote his final notes for the day. Brief, clear, unwavering. He signed each with the same hand that had shaped the world and set the stylus down beside his lamp. The flame flickered once, then steadied. The empire slept, not knowing it was dreaming of him. Peace, for Rome, had always been temporary, a pause between wars, a breath drawn before another conquest. But under Augustus, something different emerged, a peace that was not exhaustion nor surrender, but design. This was not a truce, but a structure, the Pax Romana, Roman peace. The empire stretched farther than any before it, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. And across that vastness, for the first time in human memory, came silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but civilization breathing steadily. The sound of order replaced the sound of arms. Wheels on paved stone, the rhythm of hammers building aqueducts, the low chant of markets opening at dawn. Rome had turned its legions inward, and in doing so had discovered peace as architecture. This peace was not gentle, it was deliberate. It required discipline, from rulers and ruled alike. But to the weary world, discipline felt like mercy. The soldiers who had once fought each other now guarded the edges of the known world. They built forts on the Rhine, bridges across the Danube, and watchtowers that overlooked the deserts of Syria. Their camps were miniature Romes, gridded streets, command tents at the center, baths, temples, workshops. Wherever they camped, villages grew. Wherever they retired, cities were born. A legion no longer meant war, it meant permanence. When veterans settled in colonies, they brought Roman law, Roman speech, Roman habits. They married local women, taught their children Latin, and filled the marketplaces with the quiet rhythm of belonging. In a single generation, frontiers became provinces. Provinces became Rome. Peace travels best on stone. Augustus repaired old roads and built new ones, stretching them like veins through mountains and plains, linking cities, camps, and harbors into one vast circulatory system. At their center stood the Miliarium Aureum, the golden milestone in the Forum, inscribed with the names and distances of every corner of the empire. It was more than a monument. It was a promise that every journey, however far, would lead back to Rome. Couriers rode those roads day and night. Letters moved faster than thought. Orders reached generals, taxes reached treasuries, and the emperor's words echoed from one horizon to another. Merchants followed with silks, glass, amber, spices, and grain. The same coins, stamped with the calm profile of Augustus, passed from hand to hand in markets thousands of miles apart. To hold one was to touch the empire itself. To spend it was to confirm its reality. The sea, once feared as barrier, became a highway. The Mediterranean was now called Mare Nostrum, our sea. It belonged not to any one coast, but to the rhythm of Rome itself. Ships sailed in convoys under imperial protection. Piracy, once rampant, was nearly gone. Ports thrived. Alexandria fed Rome with its grain. Ostia sent goods up the Tiber like offerings to a living god. From Spain came oil. From Gaul came wine. From Africa came marble and elephants and gold. From the East came stories, new gods, new colors, new philosophies. Trade no longer meant danger, it meant continuity. And in that continuity, peace became a habit. Within Rome itself, the transformation was physical. The streets that had once been narrow and uneven were widened, repaved, lined with marble colonnades. Temples long ruined were restored, new ones rose. The Temple of Mars Ultor, the Altar of Peace, the Forum of Augustus. Each structure spoke softly of stability. Each reminded citizens that their empire was not chance but destiny fulfilled. Marble gleamed where once there had been brick. Fountains ran where once there had been dust. And in the evenings, as the lamps were lit, the glow of the city looked almost divine. Visitors wrote that Rome felt eternal, as though it had always been this way. They did not see how much work it took to make eternity seem effortless. Augustus understood that marble alone cannot hold peace, so he bound it with law. He organized provinces into two kinds, those governed by the Senate, peaceful, prosperous, and those governed by himself, strategic, restless, guarded by legions. It looked like cooperation. It was controlled. He sent governors who answered directly to him, not to the Senate. He created a postal system to carry official orders, an intelligence network to report unrest, and a treasury to manage taxes with mathematical precision. Justice became predictable. That was its genius. In the Republic, law had been an argument. In the Empire, law became a rhythm. Cases were heard, appeals processed, sentences enforced. It did not matter where one lived. In the hills of Etruria or the ports of Egypt, the law spoke with the same voice, steady, reasoned, unhurried. For the first time in history, citizens could feel civilization as something reliable. Peace does not announce itself. It accumulates. It gathers in the sound of sandals in the marketplace, in the smell of baking bread, in the laughter of children in public baths. These were the new songs of Rome. Ordinary sounds elevated to sacred status by contrast with what had come before. Writers called this age securitas, the safety that allows men to think again. Painters found color again in frescoes. Poets found faith again in language. Philosophers spoke of harmony between man and nature. In the quiet of stability, the mind could wander without fear. And from that wandering came art, architecture, and the slow flowering of civilization itself. In the Campus Martius, Augustus built the Ara Pacis, the altar of peace. It was simple in form, but profound in message. Carved along its walls were scenes of family, harvest, and procession. Not gods in battle, but people are at rest. Children clutching their mothers' hands, priests carrying garlands, senators walking beside the emperor, their faces calm, their gestures are measured. It was propaganda, of course, but the gentlest kind. Not shouting victory, but whispering permanence. Visitors would stand before it and feel something wordless, a sense that history had at last stopped running and begun to settle. It became in time the symbol of an age, the moment when peace became identity. Even peace needs borders. Beyond the Rhine and Danube, tribes still moved, restless, fierce, free. Beyond the deserts of Arabia and the mountains of Armenia, other empires breathed. Augustus understood that stillness survives only when it knows where to end. So he drew the edges carefully, not in conquest but in containment. He stationed legions like sentinels on the rim of the world. He built roads that stopped where wilderness began. He sent diplomats as often as generals, treaties as often as troops. The empire's strength was not expansion anymore, it was endurance. He did not need the world to be Roman. He only needed Rome to last. Peace, once achieved, becomes invisible. People forget how fragile it is. In the markets, traders argued over prices. In theaters, poets mocked politicians. In villas, philosophers debated the nature of virtue. Life became ordinary again. That was its triumph. Augustus had done what no conqueror before him had ever managed, to make calm feel natural, to make civilization feel inevitable. And though he still ruled from the Palatine, his presence had become almost mythic, the quiet assurance behind every routine. The empire no longer waited for commands. It simply flowed according to his pattern. He had turned the government into an atmosphere. At sunset, across distant provinces, temple bells rang in different languages, but in the same rhythm. Smoke from hearths rose like prayers. Merchants closed their shops, soldiers cleaned their armor, families gathered for meals under soft lamplight. If you had looked down from the stars, you would have seen a world glimmering with order, a civilization breathing in synchrony. And somewhere, on the Palatine Hill, the emperor sat quietly, reading reports by lamplight, listening to the faint hum of the city below, the sound of peace as an empire. He had inherited chaos and transformed it into cadence. And for a moment, a brief, shining century, the world believed it could last forever. When Rome spoke about itself, it spoke in marble. It spoke of emperors, temples, law, destiny. But the truth of the empire, the thing that actually kept it alive, did not live in the palaces or the Senate or even the legions. It lived in kitchens, in gardens, in work done with hands that would never touch a throne. This is the Rome most people belong to, not an empire of conquest, but an empire of routine. Picture a morning in southern Gaul. The sky is pale with early light. Mist hangs low over rows of vines. A wooden farmhouse crouches against the slope, its roof tiled in red clay, its walls whitewashed to hold the cool of the night. A man wakes before the sun, as his father did and his grandfather did. He is not Roman by blood, his grandmother spoke a Celtic tongue. But he pays Roman taxes in Roman coin, follows Roman planting schedules on a Roman calendar, and calls on Roman law if a neighbor steals water. Was he conquered? Yes. But ask him and he won't describe it that way. He'll say, I belong to Rome, the way someone might say, I belong to the valley, or I belong to the river. Belonging, not submission. That's how the empire lasted. He steps outside and checks the vines. The grapes hang heavy, still damp from the night. He runs his thumb across a leaf, checking for mold. He's a veteran. You can tell from the old scar on his forearm and the stiffness in his left knee. He once wore armor with an eagle on the standard. He once slept in a marching camp under the northern rain. Now he walks his own land, on a quiet slope 5 days' travel from any frontier. That land was part of his service grant, payment for years under the standard. Rome did not only reward loyalty with praise, it paid in soil. He has a wife now, 3 children, a small tiled shrine in the corner of his house where household gods stand beside a tiny carved figure of Augustus. He does not kneel to the emperor, he thanks him. There is a difference. After inspecting the vines, he checks the irrigation trench cut along the hill. The trench is Roman design, angled for even flow, stone-lined to resist collapse. The trench will outlive him. He ties grape clusters with bits of twine, hums a marching rhythm while he works, stops occasionally just to look out across land that is his. This is the peace Augustus wanted people to feel, not gratitude for the empire, security in it. Now travel in your mind to the east, the city of Antioch, gateway to Syria and beyond. Stone streets, painted colonnades, palm trees catching the morning light like bronze. Here, Rome feels different, softer, blended. You hear Greek, Aramaic, Latin, Egyptian, all in the same street. Perfume, spice, incense, olive oil, papyrus scrolls, dyed cloth, fresh figs stacked in pyramids. In the central market, a woman in a pale linen dress runs a stall with baskets of dates and sesame cakes. Her bracelets shine gold at the wrist. She was born here. Her mother was born here. Her mother's mother, too. This place was part of the Seleucid kingdoms before it was Roman. Rome didn't build the city, Rome claimed it. But what Rome did was something else. It made sure caravans could arrive safely. Caravans from Mesopotamia, caravans from Arabia, caravans carrying lapis, cinnamon, incense baked in hardened resin to survive the desert air. Merchants who used to travel with armed guards now travel under Roman seal. That seal is worth more than bronze. It means no one will touch you, and if they do, someone will answer for it. In time, that promise became an economy. So our merchant woman in Antioch can sell goods from lands she has never seen, to customers who will bring those goods to lands she will never visit, under laws written in a city she has never entered. That is empire, not only walls and swords, but predictability. Near her stall, in the shade of a column, two men sit on low stools arguing over a contract. One is local, one is an immigrant from Italy. Originally, they spoke different languages. Now they argue in the same one, legal Latin. They quote clauses, they name witnesses, they mention the governor. They will take their dispute to a magistrate instead of to knives. And that, more than anything, is what Rome has sold to the world. Midday in a mining town in Hispania, heat presses down like a hand, dust sticks to skin, metal hangs in the air, copper, silver, sweat. At the end of his shift, a miner, shoulders blackened, arms shaking from strain, walks not home, but to the baths. A Roman-style bathhouse with a stone floor, a heated room, and a pool. It isn't luxurious the way baths in Rome are. No mosaic gods, no marble statues, no philosophers reciting poetry in the steam. But it is clean, it is warm, it is shared. Inside, voices echo against curved plaster walls. Men sink into the pool with slow relief, letting heat pull the ache from their hands. Someone jokes, and the whole room laughs in that worn-out way working people laugh, where the laugh is half exhaustion and half gratitude that they can still laugh at all. This is also an empire, not glory, not banners, a public bath in a dusty town at the edge of nowhere. Rome didn't just conquer territory, it standardized comfort. That is how you make strangers feel like citizens. Night in the capital, not in the palaces on the Palatine, not in the villas on the hill, but in an insula, a crowded apartment block in one of the busier districts. It's noisy, always. You hear footsteps overhead, pot lids clattering, a baby crying somewhere behind a reed-thin wall, someone downstairs singing after too much watered wine. The room is one small space, maybe two. A mother's mending a tunic by lamplight. Her son, 8, maybe 9, is at the table, tracing letters on a wax tablet, carefully, slowly, tongue between his teeth. His letters are Latin, but his grandparents spoke Umbrian, and the family across the hall moved from Numidia. And the fish seller downstairs swears in Greek when he's angry. This floor, this hallway, this block, it is Rome in miniature. On the table is a small dish of olives, a bowl of lentils, a heel of yesterday's bread. Nothing extravagant, nothing poetic, but the food is there. Grain shipments have come in on schedule, prices have not spiked. No one pounded on the door today demanding emergency tax to fund yet another civil war. To lower Rome, stability felt like mercy. Outside the window, you can hear mule carts rolling over stone even at night. Someone is calling out fresh fish near the river. Two men are arguing loudly about chariot teams. Life, just life. Ordinary, irritating, dependable life. People fall asleep in that sound. They begin to think, this is normal, this will last. That belief is power. Under Augustus, citizenship began to spread outward like warm light. Some received formal status, full Roman citizenship. Some received partial rights, marriage, property, legal appeal. Some had no legal change at all, but felt Roman anyway. Interesting thing about identity, you don't always need papers to believe you belong. You just need to feel included in the system that feeds you, protects you, and remembers you. Rome wasn't only armies marching into new lands. Rome was new lands waking up and saying, we are part of something big. A fisherman in the port at Ostia could talk weather with a merchant from Africa and they'd both swear by the emperor's name. A craftsman in Lyon could carve an altar to local river spirits and still offer thanks to Augustus for the stability of winter roads. A sailor in Alexandria could gamble with a sailor from Sicily using the same coin. That's more than the government. That's shared reality. Before Augustus, a child could be born in Rome and, by the time they were 12, live through food riots, street soldiers, executions in the Forum, crackdowns, purges, rival generals marching on the city. Under Augustus, a child could be born in Rome, grow to 12, and never hear a trumpet except in a parade. Imagine what that does to the mind. If you grow up in chaos, you expect chaos. If you grow up in order, you expect order. The children of this age, the first true children of the empire, learned to expect safety. They learned that grain arrives, that the baths are open, that roads are patrolled, that the night watch walks with oil lamps, that no army will suddenly appear and declare a new Rome in the morning. That expectation became loyalty, not worship, not ideology, just, this world works, please don't break it. When people want a thing not to break, they defend it. Augustus understood that better than anyone alive. Religion had always been part of Roman life, but under Augustus, it softened. There were still sacrifices, still augurs reading the will of the gods, still temples where smoke rose in perfumed ribbons toward a painted ceiling. But something else crept in: gratitude. Ordinary Romans, shopkeepers, bricklayers, fruit sellers with rough hands, began to fold Augustus into their prayers alongside Jupiter and the household spirits. Not as a god, not yet, but as a presence. May the gods keep the harvest strong, they would say, and may Augustus's peace hold. It sounds small, it isn't. When people start connecting cosmic safety to a living ruler, that ruler stops being a politician. He becomes a condition. You don't argue with a condition. You live inside it. Imagine the empire at dusk. In Gaul, our veteran farmer sits with his family under olive light. The grape skins stain his hands a deep purple. His son is asleep against his shoulder. In Antioch, our market seller ties shut her stall and counts coins into a clay jar. She tucks the jar beneath a folded cloth, whispers a short blessing, and smiles because tomorrow feels predictable. In Hispania, our miner leans back against warm stone, steam still on his skin from the bath. His muscles ache, but not with fear. With work, there's a difference. In Rome, our mother blows out the lamp and listens to the muffled city breathing through thin walls. She does not clutch her child tonight when footsteps pass in the alley. She no longer startles at shouts. She has learned which sounds are danger and which are just Rome being Rome. And high above them all, on the Palatine Hill, light still burns behind one window. Augustus, not yet old, not yet finished, is awake, reading reports, approving supplies, rotating garrisons, smoothing over border tensions before they become sparks. Thousands sleep because one man refuses to. And in that simple rhythm, the empire holds. Every empire believes its edges are eternal. But if you stood there, at the northern forests, the desert sands, or the highlands of Armenia, you would know better. Peace fades gradually, like light along the horizon. Beyond the last milestone, roads turn to paths, Latin becomes accent, and the smell of the wind changes. Here Rome was not certain. It was a suggestion. Along the Rhine, peace wore armor. Fortresses lined the river like beads on a chain, each with its watchtowers and signal fires. At dusk, smoke drifted low across the water. The air smelled of pine and iron. Legionaries moved through camp, their movements measured, unhurried. Men who knew their routines as priests know prayers. Beyond the opposite bank, the forest waited. Dark, endless. The Germans watched from among the trees, silent shapes in the half-light. They were not Rome's enemies, not yet, but they were not subjects either. They traded cattle for wine, amber for bronze. They smiled, nodded, promised, withdrew. And the Romans, for all their discipline, felt a shiver of respect. Every night, a sentry would look across that river and wonder where the empire truly ended, at the water's edge or in the mind that feared what lay beyond it. Far south and east, the deserts of Arabia and Egypt offered a different frontier, a horizon of heat instead of shadow. Here the legions built roads that shimmered in the sun, stone stations spaced by the day's march, cisterns carved to trap every drop of rain. Caravans passed through, camels swaying, bells clinking, dust rising in golden veils. The soldiers in these outposts learned patience the way others learned swordsmanship. They measured time by sunrise, not by trumpet. Sometimes a trader would arrive from deep in the desert, eyes rimmed with kohl, robe the color of the dunes, and speak of kingdoms farther still. Parthia, India, lands where Rome was only rumored. The centurion would listen, smile, and mark the story on a wax tablet because Rome's curiosity traveled farther than its armies ever would. At night, the sky was a sea of stars. The soldiers lay on their backs, listening to the wind slide over the dunes, and for a moment, even the empire seemed small. Westward across cold waters, another experiment unfolded. Britannia. The legions there learned rain and mud and patience. They built roads through bog and heather, bridges over rivers that froze in winter, forts that steamed in the damp. They taught locals how to shape tiles and bricks, how to heat a bath, how to pave a street. And yet Britannia never felt truly Roman. The mist was too thick. The hills kept their secrets. The Druids still whispered to stones older than history. But Rome left its pattern there: straight lines, right angles, Latin inscriptions on altars to strange gods. Centuries later, even when the legions were gone, the roads would remain, pointing always toward a center that no longer answered. In the east, the empire met its reflection. Across the Euphrates lay Parthia, a civilization as proud, as ancient, as stubborn as Rome. Between them stretched a silence filled with envoys, merchants, spies. Augustus knew he could not conquer Parthia without reopening every wound he had just healed, so he chose theater instead of war. He negotiated the return of captured Roman standards, symbols lost in old defeats. When they were brought back to Rome, the people cheered as if a battle had been won. Victory through narrative, that was Augustus' art. In the eastern cities, Tarsus, Antioch, Damascus, temples rose that mixed Greek columns with Persian curves, Roman inscriptions with local gods. Peace here was a conversation. Every dialect carried part of Rome's voice. To live on a border was to live between worlds. In the northern forts, officers kept small gardens, patches of green beside barracks of stone. They grew herbs from Italy, parsley and thyme and the scent of home. When frost killed them, they planted again. In the desert outposts, soldiers trained falcons to hunt. They carved dice from bone, played games under the stars. Letters from Rome took months to arrive. By the time answers came, the questions had changed. Yet none complained. They believed themselves guardians of civilization's edge. Their lives were stories waiting to be told. When leave came, they returned to towns that barely remembered them, spent their pay in crowded taverns, and spoke of horizons most citizens would never see. They were Rome's memory stretching outward. Everywhere they went, they built walls, bridges, tombs, altars. At the empire's limits, inscriptions appear in Latin, carved by hands long vanished. Here ends the world. For the safety of the emperor. Peace through vigilance. Simple phrases, but together they read like heartbeat marks on the map. Even now, if you walk those ruins, you can feel the rhythm of their intent. They weren't only defending Rome, they were defining it. There were nights when the frontiers went completely still. No wind, no footsteps, only the creak of wood and the breathing of men half asleep in their armor. In that stillness, peace felt fragile. One arrow, one spark, one ambition could undo it. But dawn always came. The centuries changed. The cook fires smoke. Life resumed its slow ritual. That too was victory. Not conquest, continuity. Back in Rome, the maps were painted perfectly, solid lines enclosing the known world. But the truth was softer. Borders blurred, customs merged, the empire breathed through exchange. A Roman road might end at a foreign shrine. A Latin inscription might sit beside words in another alphabet. A Roman soldier might pray to a local god before battle. The Pax Romana was not a uniform peace. It was layered, 1,000 local agreements stitched together by habit and hope. And somehow, against all logic, it worked. Reports from these frontiers arrived weekly to the Palatine. Augustus read them with the same quiet patience he gave to everything. He knew he would never see most of the lands he ruled. He ruled them through trust, through repetition, through faith in the pattern he had built. Sometimes when the wind was right, he could smell the sea from his balcony. He would close his eyes and imagine it stretching outward, touching every shore that called him emperor. He ruled a world he could only picture, and in picturing it, he kept it whole. At the empire's edge, whether forest, desert, or sea, evening falls the same way. The air cools, the watchfires flare. Somewhere a sentry hums a song he learned in a far-off province. Stars rise over roads that point always toward Rome, and far away, in the capital, the same stars shine over marble domes. For a moment, distance dissolves. The center and the edge share the same sky. That was the real Pax Romana, not the absence of war, but the quiet knowledge that from one horizon to another, people looked up at the same constellations and believed they lived under the same peace. The wars were long over. The legions held their posts. The people, for the first time in memory, looked forward instead of back. Augustus had given them something more powerful than conquest, a reason to create again. The city, still warm from reconstruction, filled not just with marble, but with imagination. Painters, poets, sculptors, philosophers all found their voices renewed, like musicians testing the first notes of peace. The world no longer needed heroes, it needed harmony. In this calm, words became Rome's new victories. The Forum no longer echoed with speeches of war, but with recitations of verse. Poetry replaced prophecy. There was Horace with his odes to moderation and friendship, lines that flowed like wine poured carefully into a cup. Aureum mediocritatem, he wrote, the golden mean, the perfect balance between too much and too little. Augustus loved that phrase. It described not only a philosophy, but his entire reign. Then came Virgil, quiet, patient, deliberate, the poet who gave Rome its soul. He wrote of Aeneas, a man who fled the burning of Troy to found a new destiny on foreign shores. It was myth, but it was also memory, a story that turned Augustus' rule into fulfillment of divine fate. In Virgil's lines, Rome's peace became the endpoint of history. The wars, the suffering, the rise of Augustus, all became chapters of a cosmic plan. No army could have done more for the emperor's image than the rhythm of Virgil's pen. Behind these artists stood Maecenas, Augustus's friend, confidant, and patron. He understood what the emperor did, that art is not luxury but architecture for belief. He gathered poets in his villa, offering them safety, stability, and purpose. They were not ordered to praise Augustus, they simply could not avoid it. His peace was their heir, his rule their subject. The pen became the instrument of the empire. And yet, remarkably, the poems that survived speak not of flattery, but of humanity. Love, mortality, friendship, fear, time. In the calm of empire, people had space again to wonder about small things. As poets wrote, sculptors and architects shaped Rome's visible serenity. Temples rose like prayers in stone. Porticos shaded the streets from summer heat. Public baths became sanctuaries of leisure and equality, the one place where senator and shoemaker shared the same water. Statues of Augustus appeared everywhere, but always idealized. Not the man of age and fatigue, but the eternal youth. Calm, symmetrical, God-touched. He stood barefoot in marble halls, gesture lifted slightly, expression poised between authority and forgiveness. This was not flattery, it was language. It told every citizen the same silent story, that the emperor was not merely ruling Rome, he was from Rome. At the heart of the capital, a new space took form, the Forum of Augustus. White marble colonnades, a temple to Mars the Avenger at its center, and along its walls, rows of statues of Rome's greatest ancestors, Aeneas, Romulus, heroes, statesmen, generals, each standing in quiet alignment as if waiting for history's inspection. It was made permanent. Every visitor walked through Rome's lineage and arrived at its culmination, Augustus himself. He had written himself into the city's architecture. Every stone was an autobiography. It was not only in Rome. Across the empire, the same aesthetic bloomed. Cities copied the capital's proportions, its arches, its baths, its colonnades. Even the smallest provincial town could boast a miniature of Rome's symmetry. It was as though the emperor had drawn his signature across continents of stone. To be Roman now was to live in rhythm. Streets were laid out in perfect squares, temples aligned to the sun, theaters designed so that every word, even whispered, carried to the back row. Rome had made geometry emotional. The revival of temples did more than honor the gods. It gave Rome a mirror. Each column, each statue, each inscription told the same quiet lesson. Order is divine. Where chaos once reigned, the structure now stood. Augustus even restored the calendar, a reform begun by Caesar but perfected under his successor. Months stabilized, days flowed in sequence. Time itself seemed to align with his reign. The universe under his watch had found its rhythm again. Yet within this splendor there were still people, ordinary souls walking among the monuments. A woman filling her jug at a public fountain looked up at the marble gods and smiled faintly, as if recognizing her own reflection in their calm faces. A boy ran through the portico, the sound of his sandals echoing between columns. To him, peace was normal. The empire was the air he breathed. And somewhere, an old man leaned against a wall, eyes half closed, remembering a time when these streets echoed with riots and blood. He said nothing. He simply watched, and perhaps for the first time he felt safe enough to forget. With peace came reflection. Philosophy returned to favor, not the fiery rhetoric of the Republic, but the gentler wisdom of endurance. Stoicism found a home in the empire. Its calm acceptance matched the new rhythm of life. Live according to nature, the philosophers said. Do your duty, accept what is beyond you. Augustus liked such thoughts. They suited his image, disciplined, moderate, inevitable. Men who had once debated war strategy now debated the good life, what it meant to live well, to live rightly, to live quietly. In their serenity, you can almost hear the empire's heartbeat slowing to a steady, peaceful pulse. In earlier centuries, life had been brief. Wars, famine, and uncertainty had kept the horizon close. Under Augustus, people began to plan, to build homes for their grandchildren, to plant olive trees whose fruit they might never see. That was new. Peace gives people patience. It makes time feel generous again. And with that patience came curiosity. Astronomers tracked the stars. Engineers experimented with arches and vaults. Doctors began to record symptoms and remedies systematically. Civilization, unthreatened, began to study itself. Yet even golden ages cast shadows. For every poet who sang of harmony, there was one who saw the quiet tension underneath. Ovid, playful and sharp, mocked the emperor's moral reforms, laughed at virtue and paid the price, banished to the edge of the Black Sea, where the waves froze in winter and the sky felt empty. Augustus rarely lost his temper, but when he did, it was final. He had built peace on obedience, and disobedience, however witty, was noise he would not allow. The poets learned. The empire learned. Even serenity has boundaries. By the time Augustus entered his later years, Rome glittered with calm. The city of brick he had inherited was now the city of marble he had promised. Visitors wrote that it felt more like a dream than a place, a vision of perfection made real. But perhaps that was its truest illusion. For nothing perfect remains still forever. Even as statues gleamed and poets praised the unending peace, time moved silently beneath it all, preparing its next act. In public, he was eternal. In private, he was simply tired. Augustus had spent decades perfecting the illusion of balance. Now, in the golden stillness of his later years, he began to feel how heavy harmony could be. The empire ran like clockwork, and like any clock, it ticked whether the maker slept or not. Every letter that reached his desk began with praise. Every meeting ended with assurance. But assurance is not the truth. He knew the price of stability. Endless attention, unbroken vigilance. The soft fear that if he looked away too long, the peace he'd built might begin to fray. Time, which he had bent so skillfully to his order, had begun to bend him. His hair thinned to silver. His step grew slower. The same voice that once filled assemblies now rasped when he spoke too long. The sculptors, of course, ignored all this. His statues still showed the same ageless face, the serene youth of the early empire. Visitors bowed before marble perfection, but the man behind it felt the small betrayals of age, a tremor when signing decrees, a stiffness in the joints, the soft ache that arrived before storms. He began to rise later, retire earlier, and speak less in public. Those who had known him in youth noticed the change and pretended not to. They spoke instead of his wisdom, his restraint, his calm. But even calm becomes a kind of fatigue when carried too long. He had always believed that peace would bring freedom, that once the world was still, he could rest. Yet the opposite proved true. Peace was not an ending, it was a responsibility that never slept. He had built systems so efficient that every problem found its way to him. Every border dispute, every famine, every failing bridge, his name was the final answer. And so he sat, hour after hour, reading reports until the ink blurred before his eyes. Sometimes he would pause and look toward the window, where sunlight caught the edge of his desk. The city hummed beyond the walls, alive and obedient. It was everything he had wanted. So why did it feel so far away? Only Livia saw the full measure of his weariness. She moved through the palace like reflection itself, soundless, precise, the one presence that could approach him without permission. She had grown older too, but her composure never faltered. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was always arranged with the same immaculate care. They still spoke often, but their words had softened, less strategy, more reminiscence. They spoke of gardens, of grandchildren, of weather, sometimes of loss. At night she would read aloud to him from scrolls of old philosophy, stoic maxims, poems about time. He would listen with closed eyes, and she would watch his breathing slow, wondering if he was drifting into thought or sleep. They had ruled together for so long that even silence between them felt deliberate. The Palatine Palace was large, but loneliness has no respect for architecture. The courtyards, once filled with petitioners, grew quiet. The corridors, once echoing with envoys' voices, now heard mostly footsteps and the whisper of attendants. Augustus found himself listening to those sounds, the small noises of maintenance that keep great machines alive. Sometimes he would wander through the halls at dusk, hands clasped behind his back, and stop before statues of ancestors. The lamps threw long shadows across their carved faces. He wondered whether they had ever felt this same hollowness, the sense of having built something too vast to belong to any one man. In the stillness, the city below seemed almost unreal. He had dreamed it so completely, it sometimes felt like it existed only because he imagined it each morning. Age brings one question no empire can ignore: who comes next? Augustus had prepared for this question many times, and every answer had been taken from him. Marcellus gone, Agrippa gone, Gaius and Lucius gone. Now only Tiberius remained, capable, disciplined, and utterly joyless. Livia urged him to trust her son. Augustus hesitated. Tiberius lacked warmth, but he understood the order. Perhaps that was enough. Still, Augustus could not escape the feeling that his careful design would change once he was gone, that peace, so delicately balanced, would harden into control. He drafted letters naming Tiberius heir, then rewrote them again and again, never satisfied with the tone. He was not only passing power, he was passing a story, the story of how one man turned chaos into calm. He needed that story to survive him. Sometimes he would sit in his garden and remember the boy he once was, the uncertain youth who inherited Caesar's name. He remembered nights on campaign, the smell of rain on tents, the sound of soldiers' laughter fading into sleep. He remembered Antony's rage, Cleopatra's charm, the shifting tide of alliances, and he thought, how simple ambition had seemed then, how pure. Now, with peace achieved, he could barely remember what rest felt like. He smiled at the irony. Perhaps that was Rome's curse, that it could conquer the world but never itself. His piety deepened with age, not out of fear but familiarity. He had spent a lifetime speaking of destiny, and now he wanted to believe it personally. He prayed in the old Roman way, formally, modestly, offering incense and silence. When he passed the altar of peace, he would stop to watch the smoke rise. He had built it as symbol, but now it felt like a conversation. He no longer asked the gods for victory. He asked them for continuity, that what he had made would last, and that Rome in its own way would outlive him gently. In his later years, his meals became small rituals. He dined simply, figs, olives, fish, and watered wine. He liked to eat with a few old friends, men who had known him before the marble. They would talk of memories, but always carefully. Even nostalgia was moderated. Sometimes music would play, a flute, a lyre. He would listen quietly, eyes half closed, and the lines on his face would soften. For a moment, he looked less like an emperor and more like a man finally allowing himself to breathe. But the moment always ended. Someone would clear his throat, mention some report from a province, and duty would reassert itself, as it always did. In his 75th year, he began to feel a certain chill that would not leave. The doctors said it was nothing. He smiled politely, as one who already knows the truth, but lets others keep their illusions. He began to write more letters, not decrees, but reflections. Notes to Livia, to governors, to temples. Simple things, gratitude, caution, blessing. Each evening he would read them over and feel a strange peace. He had spent his life orchestrating orders. Now at last he could sense the approach of something he could not arrange. He did not resist it. He simply observed it, the way one watches a tide come in. By now, the line between the two had blurred. People spoke of him as if he were already legend, the divine Augustus, father of the nation, the man who had found Rome brick and left it marble. He would smile at that phrase when he heard it repeated. It was true, but incomplete. He had also left it quieter, more fragile, more dependent on peace than it realized. He had given the world calm, and calm, he now understood, is the most delicate thing ever built. One evening, he stood alone on the terrace of his home. The city stretched below, lamplight glittering like fallen stars. He listened. The hum of markets, the distant echo of laughter, the murmur of Rome at rest. He thought, if this is all my life was for, it is enough. He turned, walked back inside, and the door closed softly behind him. Every dream, when fulfilled, begins to fade. Not because it fails, but because the mind that dreamt it cannot stay awake forever. For years, Augustus's Rome had glittered. The streets gleamed, the poets sang, the altars smoked with gratitude. But beneath the marble calm, something restless began to stir. The empire had become so perfectly ordered that it no longer knew what to reach for. And an empire without struggle starts to measure itself in smaller anxieties. The citizens, once grateful for peace, grew accustomed to it. The veterans who had known about the war were dying. The youth who had never known chaos grew impatient with moderation. Peace, like all luxuries, becomes invisible once it's complete, and what people no longer notice, they stop protecting. In the shaded courtyards of the city, children of senators studied their rhetoric and history, reciting lines from Virgil and Cicero. They bowed to Augustus' image, spoke his name with reverence, but it was a ritual, not a memory. He was legend to them, not the man who had rebuilt the world, but a symbol printed on their coins. They talked of philosophy, of wealth, of the future. Some, quietly, began to wonder if the Republic had truly needed to end. It was safe to wonder now. That was the irony. The emperor's success had created a generation free enough to question him. The Senate still met, but its purpose had changed. Once it had been the storm at the center of Roman politics, a place of clashing wills, rivalry, persuasion, ambition. Now it was a ceremony. The senators gathered, bowed, debated nothing of consequence, and passed resolutions that had already been decided elsewhere. It looked like governance. It was theater. Augustus had never abolished the Senate. He had simply made it unnecessary. And yet, that very quiet, that smooth, unbroken order made the city's older men uneasy. They had lived through chaos. They recognized what silence could hide. No empire is without whispers. In taverns and porticos, among soldiers returning from distant postings, among poets denied their patron's favor, small voices began to test the air. They did not speak of rebellion, only nostalgia. Of the days when politics had pulse, when orators shouted in the forum, when citizens still believed their voice mattered. It was not anger, it was aching. Even peace can feel oppressive when it never ends. Wealth gathered like water at the capital. New villas climbed the hills. Banquets grew longer, perfumes thicker, silk is more common. Merchants from the east brought jewels and spices, and senators' wives competed in opulence. What had begun as celebration of stability drifted toward indulgence. Augustus watched it with mild disapproval. He issued moral edicts, laws on marriage, fidelity, restraint. He fined bachelors, rewarded families. It was his attempt to legislate virtue in a city already forgetting what virtue meant. People obeyed publicly, ignored privately. The emperor, for all his power, could not control my appetite. In these later years, Livia's shadow lengthened. Her intelligence was undimmed. Her circle of allies is precise. Her sense of survival is unmatched. She had guided Augustus through crises, shielded him from plots, and quietly shaped the next generation. Some whispered she was ambitious. Others that she was the empire's conscience. Perhaps she was both. When senators hesitated, she decided. When courtiers schemed, she outlasted them. When Augustus's health faltered, she became his voice. Calm, measured, absolute. In the empire's marble halls, her footsteps were history's echo. Rome itself seemed to resist rest. By day, it bustled with merchants and officials. By night, it glowed with lamps, streets alive with laughter, music, chatter. Peace had given the people energy, and energy needs expression. Amphitheaters filled. Theaters overflowed. Chariot races drew crowds so vast that the ground shook with their rhythm. The emperor's face, serene and youthful, looked down from banners and statues, but the city beneath him pulsed with hunger, for distraction, for spectacle, for something new. The same peace that had saved Rome had also made it restless. Augustus often spoke of moderation, but the empire's glory was no longer modest. Victories in Parthia, the annexation of new provinces, the expansion of trade, each was celebrated with parades and monuments. He did not need war to feel victorious. He had made peace itself his conquest. Yet somewhere deep inside, he wondered if the people still understood that distinction. They still cheered him, but their cheers sounded different. Louder, emptier, like applause for a performance whose meaning had been forgotten. He was worshipped now, not remembered. And there is a kind of loneliness in worship that even emperors cannot escape. When Virgil died, Augustus wept. The Aeneid had become Rome's national myth, and its author the quiet soul of the empire. Virgil's final request was that his unfinished manuscript be burned. Augustus refused. He ordered it published instead, completed by Virgil's friends, edited with reverence. He could not bear to let the poem vanish. It was too perfect a reflection of himself, a man chosen by fate, building peace through duty. Every Roman schoolboy would learn those lines. Every generation would inherit the same story. That empire was destiny, and Augustus its living proof. In ensuring Virgil's survival, he ensured his own. The Senate proposed new honors, temples in his name, priesthoods to guard his image, coins with divine symbols beside his face. He accepted some, declined others, and smiled at the rest. He knew what they were really doing, writing him slowly into the language of eternity. He did not resist. He simply softened the pace. "Not yet," he said once when offered godhood in his lifetime. "Let the gods remain patient. They can wait a little longer." The senators laughed, but Livia saw the truth in his eyes. He was already saying goodbye. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city still slept, Augustus would walk alone in the gardens. The marble paths glowed faintly in the moonlight. The fountains whispered. The air smelled of cypress and rain. He would pause beside the statue of Julius Caesar, his adoptive father, and study the face that had begun it all. He would think of how much he had completed and how much he had changed. He had turned Rome into peace, and peace in its stillness had begun to turn into myth. He realized then that the empire no longer needed him. It ran on its own momentum now, like a tide moving even after the moon has set. That, he thought, was what immortality really was. Not living forever, but being replaced by something that never stops moving. On his desk lay a laurel wreath, a simple crown of green, symbol of triumph, renewed each year in ceremony. He lifted it once, turned it in his hands, and saw that the leaves were beginning to dry at the edges. He smiled. Nature, at least, still told the truth. He set it down carefully and left it there, half alive, half remembered, like peace itself. The empire was shining. The emperor was fading. In that balance, Rome found its image of eternity. Light that seems everlasting only because it dies so slowly. Soon another name would rise. Another voice would speak. But for now, as the sun set behind the Palatine and the marble glowed with the last gold of evening, the world belonged to him, to the quiet architect of order, the man who made serenity possible. And all of Rome, in its countless rooms and alleys, breathed in rhythm with him, not knowing that an age was ending. In the late summer of the year 14 AD, the emperor left Rome for the last time. His health had weakened quietly over months, a slow unraveling of strength that even he could not disguise. The doctors, gentle and vague, spoke of seasonal ailments and necessary rest. But Augustus knew what rest truly meant now. He asked to travel south, to Nola, the small town near Mount Vesuvius where his father had died. It was a modest request and a poetic one. The founder of the empire would return to the place where his life had begun. He departed without ceremony. Only Livia and a few attendants rode with him. The roads he had once built so that others could reach him now carried him away from the city he had made immortal. They traveled slowly. The late summer air was heavy with cicadas, the fields golden, the sky is vast and kind. Along the way, villagers gathered to watch the passing procession. Some bowed, some stood silently, unsure what gesture could honor the man who had outlived their parents' memories. He acknowledged them with a small raise of the hand, the same calm motion that had ruled the world for 40 years. The house in Nola was simple, a villa surrounded by olive trees, with a view of distant hills where the light faded softly each evening. He liked it there. The air smelled of earth and fruit. The evenings were quiet enough to hear birds settling into the branches. He asked that no one disturb the peace with the ceremony. No guards, no heralds, no priests, only the hum of the countryside and the company of Livia. He had spent a lifetime in marble halls. It seemed fitting that his last days would be framed by simplicity. In those final weeks, he walked the gardens as strength allowed, leaning on a staff carved from cypress. He would stop often, looking up at the sky, as if studying the design of the clouds. Once, a servant found him sitting by a fountain at dusk, a wax tablet on his lap, writing slowly. "What are you composing, Caesar?" the man asked softly. "A memory," he said, then smiled. "Or perhaps a correction." Even as his body weakened, his mind remained exact. He dictated letters to governors, generals, and priests, advice for continuity, warnings about excess, and always gratitude. He spoke to each as though the empire were a single, fragile organism, and he is the physician giving instructions before departure. To Tiberius he wrote of restraint. "Command, but do not display command. Remember that calm persuades where fear divides." To the Senate he wrote of patience. "Listen before deciding. Let the city believe it still speaks." To Livia he left no written words, only a look, the kind shared by two people who have said everything and need say nothing more. In Rome, the rumors spread like a soft wind. "The emperor is ill. The emperor is resting. The emperor will recover." The people spoke of him not as a man but as a condition. It seemed impossible that the calm of their world could exist without the calm of his voice. Temples held vigils. Merchants lit lamps before his statue at night. Even the streets grew quieter, as though the city itself were listening for his heartbeat. But life continued. Markets opened. Children played. The empire's rhythm did not stop, and that, perhaps, was his greatest triumph. One evening, as the sun slipped low behind the hills, Augustus asked to be moved closer to the open window. He wanted to see the last light fall on the olive trees. Livia sat beside him, holding his hand, her thumb tracing slow circles over his knuckles. He spoke little. Only now and then a memory surfaced. He asked after the forum, the grain fleets, the theater restorations. Each detail still mattered to him, the machinery of peace still whirring in his mind. Then, as the light turned gold, he whispered something almost to himself. "I found Rome brick and left it marble." Livia smiled faintly through her tears. He had said it many times before, but this time it sounded less like pride and more like closure. As night deepened, his breathing grew shallow. Those present leaned close. He opened his eyes one last time, looked to Livia, and said softly, "Have I played my part well?" Then, after a pause long enough for her to answer with a whisper, "You have," he smiled, then applauded. And with that, the architect of Rome's eternity let go. At dawn, the villa was silent. The light came gently through the shutters. The air was still, as if even the wind was in mourning. Outside, the first olive pickers began their work, unaware that the world had changed. Messengers were dispatched immediately to Rome. They rode through the night, the sound of their hooves echoing on the roads he had once ordered paved. When they arrived at the city gates, they found it already expectant, as though some instinct had carried the news ahead of them. The journey back to Rome was ceremonial, but even the ceremony felt small beside the magnitude of absence. The procession moved slowly northward, priests, senators, soldiers, each step echoing in the heat. Along the roadside, people gathered again. They wept, but quietly. They threw flowers before the bier. They touched their fingers to their lips and then to the air, a gesture of farewell learned from the theater he had loved. The man who had turned history into performance was now its final act. Rome received him as if welcoming home a god. Every temple bell rang. Every household altar burned a lamp. The Senate convened at once, and in a voice trembling with ceremony, declared him Divus Augustus, Augustus the Divine. It was a formality he had always refused in life. In death, he could not refuse. The people poured into the streets, not wailing, but whispering, a low sea of voices rising and falling like prayer. They did not grieve the chaos returning. They grieved the man who had made its absence possible. That night, Livia remained awake in the palace, alone with the echo of her husband's absence. She sat before a small lamp, the same one that had burned beside his bed. Its flame trembled, reflected in the glass. For the first time in decades, she had no one to advise, no voice to harmonize with her own. She thought of all they had endured, the betrayals, the exiles, the reconciliations, and of how little any of it mattered now. Then she smiled through her tears, because she knew, as he had known, that the peace they had built would outlive both of them. The next morning, Rome woke under the same sun, to the same streets, the same routines. The baker lit his ovens. The bathhouse opened its doors. The Senate prepared for another session. Life resumed exactly as before. And in that resumption, in that seamless continuation, lay the emperor's truest legacy. He had built a world that could go on without him. From boy to god, from chaos to calm, Augustus's story had been the story of order itself. He had shaped time, architecture, language, and even the idea of an empire. He had turned power into patience, and in doing so, he had created the first empire designed not for conquest, but for endurance. His final act was not death, it disappeared. The man was gone. The pattern remained. And for generations afterward, as emperors came and went, each would look to his memory and whisper, "What would Augustus have done?" When Augustus died, Rome did not collapse. It exhaled. For 40 years, the empire had lived under the rhythm of his will, every decision, every silence, every gesture carrying the weight of the world. Now, for the first time in living memory, that rhythm was gone. But the world did not end. It continued precisely as he had designed it to. That was his greatest act of control. Even in absence, the machine kept moving. And at its helm now stood Tiberius, the reluctant heir, the soldier turned emperor, the man who had spent half his life standing in another man's shadow. Tiberius had not wanted power, he had wanted simplicity. Command of legions, distance from politics, and the quiet satisfaction of competence. But history has little patience for preference. In Augustus' final years, Livia had ensured her son's position was secure. Every rival had been removed, every successor groomed and gone. By the time the emperor died, there was no alternative left. And so, on a soft morning in September, Tiberius stood before the Senate and accepted the purple. He spoke modestly, almost hesitantly. He praised Augustus, declared himself unworthy, and promised continuity. It was the kind of speech the city had learned to love, humble, rehearsed, reassuring. But behind his careful words, something colder moved. Not ambition, but dread. How do you follow a god? Every street in Rome bore Augustus' mark. His face on coins, his name on temples, his laws are written into the rhythm of daily life. Even the stars seemed to shine with his memory. Poets still spoke of him as divine, and in the Forum, people referred to him simply as the Princeps, the first. Tiberius knew he could never be that. He would always be the second. He had his father's discipline, his mother's calculation, but none of their ease. He was methodical where Augustus had been graceful, stern where his predecessor had been serene. Rome felt it instantly. The temperature changed. The same order remained, but it no longer glowed. In his first months, Tiberius made no grand changes. He confirmed all of Augustus' decrees, kept the same advisors, maintained the same ceremonies. The Senate, relieved, applauded him. The people nodded approvingly, but underneath there was tension. They were waiting for something, for warmth perhaps, for a sign that peace would still feel human. It did not come. Tiberius ruled efficiently, but without affection. He saw loyalty as duty and praise as danger. He cut the excess from court life, dismissed flatterers, and withdrew from public appearances. The city that had once felt intimate with its ruler now felt watched by him instead. He carried Augustus' legacy like armor, protective but suffocating. Every act was compared, every pause was analyzed, every silence was interpreted. If he refused honors, they said he was cold. If he accepted them, they said he was vain. If he spoke softly, they called him secretive. If he spoke firmly, they called him cruel. He could not win the affection his stepfather had commanded so effortlessly. And perhaps, deep down, he did not wish to. He admired Augustus' achievement, but distrusted its methods, the theater of it, the pageantry, the illusion of choice. Tiberius did not seek love, he sought control. Livia remained in the palace, now the widow of a god and the mother of an emperor. Her presence was both comforting and complicated. She still advised Tiberius, still moved with the same grace through the marble halls, but her influence unsettled him. Rome whispered that she ruled as much as he did. That decision bore her signature, that her servants carried her orders quietly through the night. He resented it, but he could not remove her. To defy her was to defy the memory of Augustus himself. So they coexisted, mother and son, each watching the other carefully, bound by love and by power. History would remember them as symbols of succession's unease, the empire's first family learning what dynasty truly meant. Rome adjusted slowly to its new rhythm. The parades continued, the games were funded, the temples stayed open, but the atmosphere had changed. Where Augustus' Rome had been radiant, a city of gold and promise, Tiberius' Rome was muted, a city of discipline and restraint. He raised taxes on luxury goods, discouraged excess, and expanded the network of informers that watched the capital. The peace held, but it felt heavier. It was no longer the peace of prosperity. It was the peace of precaution. In time, the emperor began to withdraw, first from the Senate, then from the city itself. He preferred the company of his books, his astrologers, and the sea. He built villas along the coast, particularly on the island of Capri, a place of cliffs and still water, where the empire seemed distant and unreal. From there he governed by letter, long, precise, cautious letters filled with advice and reprimand. The empire functioned perfectly without his presence. That was Augustus's legacy in motion, a system so complete that even absence looked like order. But absence changes tone. It invites fear. Rumors spread that the emperor had grown paranoid, that he punished men without trial, that he watched the Senate through spies. Perhaps some of it was true. Perhaps all of it was projection. Rome tested the shape of unease after decades of comfort. Either way, the light that had glowed for 40 years was now dimmed to a cautious flame. The people still spoke Augustus' name with a kind of nostalgic affection. They would point to his statues in the Forum, touch the hem of his marble robe, and whisper, "It was different then." They meant, it was brighter, it was safer, it was simple. Augustus had made peace feel effortless. Tiberius made it feel conditional. Both maintained the empire, but only one had made it beloved. Yet even as the mood cooled, Rome did not crumble. The legions remained loyal. The provinces stayed stable. The economy flowed. This was the true proof of Augustus's work, that the empire could endure not just under brilliance, but under burden. Tiberius's reign, for all its austerity, confirmed what his predecessor had dreamed. Rome no longer depended on the charisma of a single man. It depended on structure, on systems, on belief in the pattern. And though Tiberius lacked warmth, he possessed something equally valuable: patience. He ruled not as a father, but as a custodian, cold, consistent, necessary. The golden age had ended, but the empire remained. Sometimes in the quiet of his villa, Tiberius would stand at the edge of the sea and watch the horizon darken. He had inherited the world's greatest peace, and it felt, to him, like isolation. He thought of Augustus often, not with affection, but with a kind of analytical admiration. How had that man managed to be both loved and obeyed? How had he ruled without being feared? The waves below offered no answer. They simply rose and fell, eternal, indifferent. And in that sound, Tiberius heard the rhythm of empire itself, vast, impersonal, enduring. It comforted him, and it saddened him all at once. Back in Rome, life continued in familiar cadence. Children still memorized Virgil. Markets still opened at dawn. Legions still stood watch beneath foreign skies. The marble city remained as Augustus had left it, immense, orderly, luminous in the sun. And if its spirit had changed, if its peace now carried a hint of distance, that too was part of its evolution. Rome was no longer the city of one man's dream. It was the civilization of the world. When a great figure dies, there are always two funerals. The first is for the body. The second is for the idea. Augustus' body had been carried through Rome with incense and laurel, laid to rest with solemn vows and trembling voices. That was the first funeral. The second funeral happened quietly. It happened in kitchens and markets and lonely frontier posts. In the first soft days when Rome began to understand that the man who held it together was finally, permanently gone. And then something unexpected happened. Nothing fell apart. That was the moment everyone realized what he had actually built. Before Augustus, Rome was fragile in a very specific way. It was powerful, yes. Ruthless, yes. Rich, yes. But it depended on whoever had the legions in that particular year. It lurched. It snapped between rivals. It bled in the Forum. It devoured the ambitious and then begged for the next ambitious man to save it. Power in the late Republic was not permanent. It was borrowed on violence. Augustus changed that. He didn't just take control, he standardized control. He didn't just win the state, he taught the state how to stay one. Laws, offices, tax routes, road systems, grain guarantees, chains of command, border strategy, imperial messaging, calendar, coinage, religion, succession rituals, all of it was pulled into a frame, tightened, made repeatable. He turned one lifetime into a template. That was the gift he left behind, and that was the danger. Because once you make a system that can continue without you, you've made something that can continue without kindness too. In the first weeks after his death, Rome still spoke of Augustus in the present tense. Augustus feeds the people. Augustus protects the peace. Augustus keeps the provinces quiet, not kept, keep, as if dying had not really separated him from the empire. And in a way, it hadn't. His name remained stamped on milestones along the roads. His face remained on coins changing hands in marketplaces. His laws remained cited in court cases. His reforms remained the structure of daily life. He was everywhere in Rome and Rome's world. Not as a person, as infrastructure. Other rulers had left statues. He left systems. The odd thing about systems is that they don't mourn you. They just continue. Officially, the Senate declared him divine. They had done this before, with Julius Caesar. This wasn't entirely new, but it felt different with Augustus. With Caesar, deification felt like outrage and revenge, like the people saying, "You killed him, so now he's above you forever." With Augustus, it felt expected, as if Rome had decided softly, Of course he was already more than human. We were just waiting for the paperwork to catch up." Temples were dedicated, flames were tended, priests were appointed to maintain his cult. And this changes the atmosphere permanently. Because once you say the previous ruler has become a god, you no longer just inherit a job, you inherit a standard. From this moment forward, every emperor would stand beneath the gaze of a divinized predecessor and know he would be judged, not just by the Senate, not just by the legions, but by the idea of a perfected past. In other words, the ghost of Augustus did not leave. He became Rome's ceiling. Tiberius would feel that. So would everyone after. In the streets, in the insula, in the baths, in the taverns, the way people talked about Augustus began to shift. Before his death, he was the princeps, the first citizen, the father of the country. After his death, he became the good days. People started using his name not to describe a person, but to describe a feeling. You'd hear someone say, while buying bread, back in Augustus' time, grain was cheaper. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. His time had become shorthand for fare. In the apartment blocks at night, mothers told their children stories not of gods and monsters, but of Augustus settling disputes, Augustus stopping famine, Augustus keeping the city safe. He was becoming folklore. He wasn't just emperor anymore. He was bedtime reassurance. That's how you know when a leader is no longer a leader. That's how you know when they've become myths. The Senate had always performed loyalty to Augustus in his presence. That much was ritual. But after his death, something stranger happened. They began performing loyalty to him in Tiberius's presence. Every praise of Augustus in those first sessions under Tiberius had two edges. Out loud, "May the new emperor honor the wisdom of the divine Augustus," meaning, don't break anything. The Senate, which had lost its power under Augustus, now clung to his memory as leverage. He had domesticated them. Now they tried to domesticate his successor. They invoked his moderation, his mercy, his caution, his preference for consultation. They quoted his sayings, they repeated his gestures, they told stories about how he used to listen. Some of it was true, some of it was fiction retrofitted into truth. All of it was pressure. Augustus, dead, was still shaping how Rome would be governed. He had become a rulebook, far from Rome, in Spain, in Syria, in Egypt, near the Rhine and Danube. The news of his death arrived late and landed differently. There was sadness, yes, reverence, a sense that a protector had gone. But more than that, there was watchfulness. Because for people outside the capital, emperors weren't just symbols. Emperors decided tax rates. Emperors answered petitions. Emperors chose governors. Emperors determined whether the road to town stayed safe or turned dangerous. A bad emperor meant fear. A careless emperor meant neglect. So in the provinces, when people heard Tiberius is emperor now, what they listened to next wasn't poetry or titles. They listened for this. Are the grain shipments still coming? Are the patrols still rotating? Are the roads still patrolled? Are bribes going up or down? In the first months after Augustus's passing, nothing changed. And that nothing was everything. Merchants kept moving. Veterans kept drawing their stipends. The courts kept sitting. Governors kept sending reports like clockwork. It was the first proof that the empire now had a spine independent of any single personality. Augustus had turned Rome from a charisma machine into an administration. That's the core of his legacy. Inside the palace, the silence was different. For the public, it was awe-inspiring. For Tiberius, it was pressure. For Rome, it was a transition. For Livia, it was absent. She had built power on presence. Every day, every conversation, every gesture had been a shared act between herself and Augustus. She had spoken in his ear and in doing so shaped the empire. Now the empire was still there. Her influence was still there. But the anchor was gone. She grieved privately. She always had. Behind closed doors she kept his things in perfect order. The stylus he'd favored, the amulets he wore for luck, the seal he used on official letters. She guarded his memory not sentimentally, but actively. She understood, better than anyone, what he had done. She understood something else too. Memory can be a weapon, and she would use that memory to secure succession, protect legitimacy, and keep the empire from splintering in the first vulnerable months. Where Augustus had been the architect, Livia became the steward of his echo. For Tiberius, the inheritance was not only power, it was a comparison. He walked into a role that had been defined as holy. But Tiberius was not holy. He was human in a way Augustus had carefully avoided appearing to be. Augustus had floated untouchable. Tiberius breathed. Augustus performed warmth. Tiberius didn't. Augustus made absolute power feel like reassurance. Tiberius made absolute power feel like surveillance. You can rule an empire with fear. You cannot soothe an empire with it. And so Rome's tone shifted. Not its laws, not its roads, not its food supply. Those stayed constant. Just its tone. A slight tightening in the air. A sense that the hand on the reins had closed a little. That change, that faint pressure, that coolness, that is also part of Augustus' legacy. Because once you create a position like emperor, you cannot control who fills it or how they wear it. The machine continues. The mood does not have to. Something else began to happen after Augustus' death. Something almost invisible at first. People started to tell small truths again. Under Augustus, there had been things you did not say. Not because he forced silence violently, but because the peace felt too precious to endanger with doubt. After his death, in back rooms and nightly conversations, people began to admit worries. I don't like the informers. I don't like the way Tiberius avoids us. I don't like that the emperor can be on an island and still control Rome. These were not rebellions. They were temperature readings. Augustus had left behind orders so perfect that Rome could finally afford to critique it. That is how stable he made it. That is also how fragile it was becoming. Because once people remember that empires are human, they remember humans can fail. By the end of that first year without him, Augustus was no longer discussed as a presence, but as a standard. This was the sentence people repeated, quietly, to each other. Will this last? They did not mean the laws. They did not mean Tiberius. They did not even mean peace. They meant, will the feeling last? The feeling of safety, the feeling of predictability, the feeling of living in a world that was not going to fall apart next week. People were no longer asking who rules Rome. They were asking what is Rome now? That switch is everything. It is the moment Rome stops being a city with an empire and becomes an empire with a capital. That is Augustus's final act. Night falls. In Rome, torches flicker along the Forum of Augustus, lighting the marble he left behind. On the frontier, a sentry leans against a wooden palisade, looking out into dark forests past the Rhine, listening to night birds and distant water. In an apartment block near the Aventine, a mother tells her son, "When I was a girl, there was always shouting. Now it's quiet. You don't understand how lucky you are." The boy nods, not fully understanding. He has never known fear in the streets. He thinks quiet is normal. In a provincial town in Africa, a magistrate stamps a document with the imperial seal and files it away, confident that a courier can carry news to Rome and receive an answer without needing bribes or blades. In Capri, Tiberius, the new emperor, studies reports by lamplight. He keeps them neatly ordered, line by line. He does not smile. In the palace, Livia sits awake beside a dim oil flame, and the shadow on the wall beside her looks, for a moment, like him. And over all of it, the system hums, not loudly, not proudly, just steadily. That hum, that living machine, is what remains of Augustus. Years passed, then decades. Augustus had become a god, Tiberius a recluse, and yet nothing broke. The world he had imagined, the world of predictability and rhythm, simply continued. It was as if Rome had learned to live without pulse, breathing in, breathing out, never gasping, never resting. The legions were still drilled. The grain fleet still sailed, the courts still opened, the taxes still flowed. There were new emperors now, cautious, competent, careful men. Caligula, Claudius, Nero, each strange in his own way, each ruling from the same marble halls Augustus once walked. The peace he had built no longer depended on virtue. It depended on habit. Even madness could not destroy it quickly. Rome's machine was too vast, too heavy, too practiced. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had outlived the man who named it. It had become an environment. To understand this peace, you must look close, not far. Picture a morning in a Roman town 100 years after Augustus's death. The baker is already awake, sliding loaves into a clay oven. Children run to school carrying wax tablets and styluses. Merchants set up stalls, glass beads, olives, bolts of dyed cloth. A priest walks by, murmuring a short blessing to the household gods. The language, the gestures, the architecture, all Roman. Even the quiet, organized patience of the morning feels Roman. No one there has ever seen an emperor, but they live inside his echo. That is what empire means at its most invisible. A way of life so normal it stops needing to explain itself. The people no longer said, "We are Roman." They said, "We are civilized." And in their minds, the two words meant the same thing. Across the empire, the roads hummed with movement. Carts creaked under grain from Egypt. Messengers rode fast horses with orders sealed in wax. Pilgrims walked barefoot to distant shrines. Veterans traveled home on routes they had once patrolled. Everywhere the milestones bore the same name, Augustus. It was almost poetic. His name still measured distance. From Gaul to Judea, from Hispania to Armenia, the world moved under his invisible handwriting. The roads had become a nervous system, carrying thoughts, orders, trade, faith, and gossip like impulses through a colossal body. And that body was still awake. At the edges, along the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts, soldiers stood as they always had. New recruits, born long after Augustus's time, still swore oaths in his name. They drilled beneath standards that bore the eagle, slept in camps patterned after his reforms, and built their lives around the rhythm of the watch. In the north, they traded with the tribes beyond the forest. In the east, they monitored the shimmer of Parthian horsemen across the plains. In the south, they guarded the long shadows of the Sahara. They called the world beyond their walls barbarian, not because it was cruel, but because it was unpredictable. Rome's peace had trained them to believe that stability was virtue. Everything else was noise. What Augustus had built was more than government, it was psychology. He had taught generations how to think about time. To see the future as extension, not upheaval. To expect tomorrow to resemble today. This expectation is the quiet engine of civilization. When people stop bracing for collapse, they begin to build. They invest in farms, they teach their children trades, they decorate homes instead of fortifying them. Augustus gave them that. Not safety, the illusion of safety that makes creation possible. And illusions, when shared by millions, become reality. The emperors who followed him inherited that illusion. Some expanded it, some abused it, some simply enjoyed it. Claudius, scholarly and cautious, added provinces and strengthened the bureaucracy. Nero, indulgent and theatrical, nearly tore the illusion apart, but even his chaos could not fully destroy what was already institutionalized. Governors kept governing. Engineers kept building. The empire absorbed eccentricity like the sea absorbs rain, because systems once mature are stronger than any single hand. That is what Augustus had wanted, not eternal perfection, but eternal continuity. In Gaul, towns that had once been Celtic strongholds now had theaters, bathhouses, and straight streets. In Africa, Roman mosaics shimmered beneath sunlit courtyards. In Britain, villas rose where tribes had once built wooden halls. In the East, Greek cities adopted Latin law while keeping their language and style. Rome had become less a place, more a mood. If you could travel across the Mediterranean in those years, you would not see a single empire by force. You would see a network of imitation. 1,000 local Romes, each dreaming of the original. Every arch, every forum, every aqueduct whispered the same quiet story. The order is beautiful. But success, if too complete, becomes stillness, and stillness invites decay. By the 2nd century, Rome was so sure of its stability that it stopped fearing change altogether. The bureaucracy thickened, ambition turned inward, politics became a ceremony. The empire had achieved what it thought it wanted. A world without uncertainty, but to be without uncertainty is to be without growth. The marble that once symbolized peace began to symbolize weight. Rome had turned serenity into inertia. Religion, too, evolved into reflection. People still offered incense to Augustus and Jupiter, but faith had become formal. Priests memorized prayers. Sacrifices followed the calendar. Belief itself had cooled to habit. The empire had replaced conviction with choreography. And yet, beneath the surface, something stirred. New gods, new rumors, new ideas whispering along the trade routes. A single seed of difference could now travel from Judea to Gaul in a month. The same roads that carried peace carried change. The machine that Augustus built had made the world connected enough to imagine alternatives. The people didn't know it, but they were living inside a long echo. Their streets, their language, their institutions, their measurements, all carried his fingerprints. And though centuries would pass, every reformer, every ruler, every philosopher would trace their lineage back to him. The Republic was a memory. The empire was a habit. Augustus was the bridge between. He had done what few humans ever manage. He had defined normal. Night falls again, centuries later, and still the lamps burn. The aqueducts hum, the baths steam, the roads shine faintly beneath the moon. From a high terrace, you could look down and still see his plan glowing beneath the layers of time. It is a strange kind of immortality, to have built something that looks effortless after you're gone. The people of this later age no longer remember him as a man. They remember him as an architect, as a calendar, as law, as a pattern. That was his final success, to disappear so completely that his design became invisible. Marble lasts longer than flesh, and Rome by now had begun to live more among its statues than its citizens. Generations had come and gone since the death of Augustus. Children grew up never seeing a soldier in combat, never hearing the panic of civil war, never feeling the fragility that had once defined their ancestors. The empire felt eternal, so eternal that even the gods had grown bureaucratic. And somewhere within that great permanence, the memory of the first emperor crystallized. Augustus was no longer remembered as the man who ended chaos. He was remembered as the man before whom chaos ended. The difference seems small, but in that shift, a mortal becomes a myth. His image was everywhere, not the living face, but the perfected one, the serene, ageless expression carved into marble centuries earlier. On coins, he never aged. In temples, he never frowned. In portraits, he was always the calm of Rome itself. Every emperor after him borrowed something from that face, the same profile, the same measured distance. Even emperors who despised him found themselves echoing him. They could not help it. He was not just an example. He was the visual definition of legitimacy. To look like Augustus was to look like Rome. By the 2nd century, Roman writers spoke of Augustus with gentle awe, not for his policies, but for his restraint. They described his rule as moderation made divine, the perfect middle between monarchy and liberty, the balance that history could never quite reproduce. It was, of course, an illusion. Augustus had ruled absolutely. He had simply done it gracefully. But illusions, when they comfort, become virtues, and the people of the empire were now addicted to comfort. They told themselves that the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, was natural law, not human achievement. They forgot that peace requires constant tending. They forgot that serenity, too, has to be fed. Walk through Rome at this time, and you would see the full flowering of what he had begun. Columns of white stone rising into the blue, arches spanning avenues, domes glinting in the sunlight. Even decay was beautiful here. Time seemed afraid to spoil what Rome had made. In the evenings, the city glowed like sculpture under firelight. Foreign visitors spoke of it in tones of disbelief. They called it a miracle of order. But behind that beauty was stillness, a calm that had stopped growing. It is possible to polish something so long that it loses warmth. The empire now was perfect marble, cold, enduring, and deaf to the heartbeat beneath. In schools, children still recited Virgil, his Aeneid, now sacred text. Every boy could quote the lines about destiny, duty, and the founding of Rome. Every teacher spoke of Augustus as the living fulfillment of that prophecy. They said, "He brought peace to the world. He gave law to mankind. He restored virtue to the city." No one asked what those words really meant anymore. They had become ceremonial. They were said with the same cadence as prayers. And like prayers, they provided comfort without question. Beyond Rome in the provinces, the myth was even stronger. In Gaul, Augustus was worshipped alongside local gods. In the east, he was called Sebastos, the revered one. In Egypt, priests offered incense before his likeness beside the old pharaohs. To farmers in the provinces, he was not history. He was from Providence, the one who had made the order permanent. People built altars to his peace the way others once built altars to the harvest. They prayed to him for rain, for safety, for fortune on journeys. The emperor had become the weather of civilization, a background certainty. But perfection is never truly still. It only hides movement. By the middle of the 2nd century, cracks had begun to show beneath the marble calm. The empire's borders stretched too wide, its administration too dense, its faith in itself too unquestioning. And when pressure builds under marble, it doesn't creak, it fractures suddenly. The signs were subtle. Governors grew complacent, taxes rose quietly, loyalty turned to formality. And yet no one panicked. How could they? They had been told for generations that Rome was eternal. The memory of Augustus, still shining from every statue, made decline seem impossible. That was the danger of his perfection. It made failure unthinkable. And what is unthinkable is also unprepared for. A new class emerged: philosophers, scholars, and historians, men who looked backward, not forward. They wrote long treatises about the greatness of the early empire. They compared every current ruler to Augustus and found them wanting. They began to speak of a golden age, as though it had been a season of divine favor, now past. They did not mean to condemn the present. They simply could not stop idealizing the past. But idealization is slow poison. It turns gratitude into nostalgia. It turns memory into argument. Soon, people loved Augustus less for what he had done, and more for what he was not, for not being now. Each new emperor, upon taking the throne, faced the same ritual, a speech invoking the name of Augustus. "I will rule as he ruled," they said. "I will preserve his peace." It was expected. It was necessary. But the irony was bitter, for every emperor knew that peace, once perfect, becomes pressure. To match Augustus was to live in comparison. To differ was to invite judgment. The first emperor had freed Rome from chaos. The next emperors were freed from nothing. They were chained to his ghost. In the Campus Martius stood the mausoleum of Augustus, the great circular tomb built by his own design. Over the centuries, it became less a grave, more a mirror. Citizens visited not to mourn him, but to remind themselves that greatness had once been simple. They would walk slowly along the path lined with cypress trees, place a hand on the cold stone, and whisper a wish for the empire's endurance. Children would stare upward at the vast drum of stone and ask, "Is he inside?" And their parents would answer, "Yes, but he is also everywhere." In that answer was the heart of Roman faith. That memory, when big enough, can replace presence. And so the empire continued, prosperous, calm, but slightly haunted. Every achievement measured against the invisible standard of the first emperor. Every peace compared to his peace. Every success was declared smaller than his. Rome had gained eternity, but I was surprised. The age of marble was beautiful, but beauty without tension is museum silence. In that silence, the first tremors of change began to whisper again. The gods were shifting. The frontiers are restless. And beyond the empire's calm horizon, new movements stirred, faiths and peoples who would one day test the very meaning of eternity. And there in the Forum, the statue of Augustus still stood, unmoving, unchanging, gazing across the city he had once ruled. Pigeons rested on his shoulders, sunlight pooled at his feet. Children ran beneath him, their laughter echoing between the columns. The world had grown around his image, but the image itself had not aged. That was his triumph. That was his curse. He had given Rome the perfect face, and now it could not imagine any other. The longer peace lasted, the less real it seemed. Children born into the calm of empire could not imagine the world that came before it. They heard stories of civil wars, of chaos and hunger, of men marching under lightning banners and shouting for power, but these were bedtime legends now, like the myths of Hercules or Aeneas. The Republic, that old word, was a ghost that lived only in classrooms. To be Roman was to inherit serenity. It was to believe that the world had found its final shape. The people no longer said, "Rome will last forever." They said, "Rome is forever." It was not hope, it was an assumption. That is how dreams speak, as if they have always been. Every empire eventually builds not to expand, but to remember itself. Rome had entered that phase. Temples rose not in honor of new gods, but of old glories. Monuments were restored rather than invented. Artists painted idealized portraits of past emperors. The marble of Augustus' age was cleaned, polished, repolished. The forum gleamed as it once had, but something in the light had changed, a little too bright, a little too polished, as if the city were performing its own memory. It was still magnificent, but it had become a museum that still believed it was alive. To live in such a time was to feel both comfort and weight. Life was predictable. Taxes arrived on time, the aqueducts worked, the baths steamed every morning, and yet a quiet unease sometimes slipped through the cracks. What happens to a world that has achieved everything? When the streets are paved and the walls are high and the gods are satisfied, what is left to do but decorate the silence? Writers began to fill that silence with philosophy. They debated fate, virtue, order. They asked whether humanity was improving or merely orbiting itself. The Stoics said peace was mastery of self. The Epicureans said peace was the absence of pain. The people of Rome, without quite meaning to, began to practice both at once. They lived well, they lived quietly, and slowly the fire that had built the empire turned to embers. A century after Augustus, poets still sang of him as if he had only just died. They spoke of a world he had tamed, a wild, storm-tossed age that bowed before his wisdom. It was no longer history. It was scripture. In libraries, scholars copied lines from Virgil and Horace, their hands tracing words like prayers. Each copy was an act of faith. Each scroll is another layer of dream between Rome and reality. Augustus had become the grammar of the empire. To speak of Rome at all was to speak in his tense. Yet beneath the surface calm, a restlessness stirred. Merchants grew richer than senators. Soldiers grew weary of borders that never changed. Philosophers whispered of new gods. The empire was still expanding, but slowly now, as if reluctantly. Its victories felt procedural, not passionate. Even triumphs sounded rehearsed. The Senate applauded them with less conviction. The citizens watched parades with polite awe. They had seen too much perfection. They had begun to crave surprise again. It was faint, the kind of hunger that starts as a sigh, but it would grow. All long peace contains, somewhere inside it, the seed of its own ending. By night, the city shimmered, fires flickering on marble, reflections dancing on the Tiber. From the Palatine, you could look down at the city and see what looked like a constellation made of earth. The noise of the day was gone. The empire seemed to be breathing in unison, millions asleep beneath one law, one language, one moon. In that stillness, you could almost believe that history had reached perfection, that humanity had found its final balance. The priests said it was divine order. The philosophers said it was reason triumphant. The poets said it was peace. But a few, those who listened carefully to silence, I heard something else. Not harmony, echo. The sound of Rome repeating itself again and again, as if afraid to wake up. Gold filled Rome's temples and treasuries. Silver filled her markets. The empire's wealth was unmatched. But wealth, like peace, dulls urgency. When everything is attainable, the will to reach fades. The Senate debated policy the way musicians tune instruments long after the concert is over. A ritual of maintenance, not creation. Officials passed laws refining laws, editing words, clarifying meanings that no longer mattered. In the provinces, governors competed not to conquer, but to host festivals. Even the legions, once the edge of Rome's ambition, became caretakers of stability. They patrolled roads, collected taxes, and spent more time on engineering than battle. It was peace at its fullest and its most fragile. Every civilization forgets its beginning. But Rome's forgetting was elegant. It didn't erase the past. It polished it until the edges disappeared. People still celebrated Augustus's birthday, still quoted his reforms, still toasted his name, but they no longer remembered why he had been necessary. The chaos he ended was a myth. The desperation he soothed was fable. They had inherited a world built from vigilance and remade it into complacency. Their ancestors had fought to make life predictable. They took predictability for granted. That is the final stage of peace, when gratitude becomes background noise. It is easy to think of decline as collapse, but decline often begins as perfection, overstaying itself. The empire's dream was too beautiful to abandon, and so it lingered, layer upon layer, like gold leaf over cracks. In theaters, actors still recited lines about the virtues of Rome. In forums, men still debated ethics over wine. In homes, parents still named their sons after emperors. No one noticed that belief had replaced curiosity. They did not see the world outside changing. They did not see the faith spreading through their ports, the merchants carrying new gods in their hearts. They dreamed, because the dream was safer than the awakening. From the sky, if one could have seen it then, Rome would have looked eternal, a continent of cities glowing in harmony, the same laws, the same streets, the same promise. But from the ground, a few sensitive souls felt the stillness growing heavy. They wrote poems about the slowness of time, about the weariness of certainty. They looked at Augustus's statues and wondered if perfection could, in its own way, become a kind of sleep. Rome was not dying. It was dreaming itself into memory. Some nights, the priests in Augustus's temple swore they heard sounds in the dark. Not wind, not mice, but footsteps. They said the divine Augustus walked the halls at midnight, checking the lamps, making sure the peace still holds. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps it was wishful thinking. But in a way, they were right. For the system he built was still moving in the dark, autonomous, perfect, tended by unseen hands. Rome had learned to walk in its sleep, and it would not wake again for centuries. The Roman world of the 2nd century CE seemed eternal. Its cities glittered with marble and mosaics. Its legions guarded the frontiers from Scotland to the Sahara. Merchants moved silk and spices through ports humming with wealth. And yet, beneath the still surface of this vast empire, quiet tremors had begun. When Emperor Marcus Aurelius came to power in 161 CE, he inherited a realm that was rich, but weary. Decades of expansion had filled the treasury, but the frontiers were stretched thin. The Pax Romana, that long peace Rome had promised, depended on constant vigilance, and on men who believed in Rome's destiny as something larger than themselves. Marcus was a philosopher king, rare in history. He spent his nights writing words that would outlast all conquests, meditations on duty, on patience, on the fleeting nature of power. But by day he rode with his soldiers, not as a distant ruler, but as a weary man who understood that the frontiers were bleeding. The northern tribes, pressed by migrations beyond their lands, began to test Rome's borders. The Marcomannic Wars dragged on for years, consuming fortunes and lives. The plague, likely smallpox, spread through cities and legions alike, brought by soldiers returning from the east. Farms emptied, markets slowed, and the great machine of empire began to strain. Still, Marcus held the line. His rule marked both the height and the beginning of the long descent, an age where virtue struggled against exhaustion. When he died in 180 CE, his ashes were placed in the mausoleum that still bears his name, overlooking the Tiber. But with him died something subtler, the fragile balance between power and purpose. For his son, Commodus, would rule not as a philosopher, but as a showman. Commodus loved the games, the spectacle, the roar of the crowd. He saw himself as Hercules reborn and Rome as his stage. He fought in the arena, a gesture that thrilled the masses but horrified the Senate. He renamed months after himself, statues after his own image, and slowly eroded the dignity that had once restrained emperors. The empire endured, as it always did, but its spirit began to shift. What had once been a republic bound by shared duty was now a theater of personalities. The Senate became cautious, servile. The army, more than ever, held the true power, not the law. When Commodus was assassinated on the last day of 192 CE, Rome did not celebrate. It simply braced. Within months, rival generals proclaimed themselves emperor, and civil war returned like a storm long foretold. The year 193 CE is remembered as the year of the 5 emperors. In one dizzying sequence, rulers rose and fell: Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and finally Septimius Severus, each backed by legions who demanded payment for their loyalty. Rome had become an empire ruled by soldiers, bought and sold like a prize. The Senate watched helplessly as imperial power drifted away from the marble halls of politics into the mud-soaked camps of the frontier. Severus, once secure, sought to bind the empire again with strength. He raised soldiers' pay, fortified borders, and left advice to his sons that would echo bitterly through time. Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. It was practical. It was fatal. For in strengthening the army, he weakened every other institution. Future emperors would rise and fall at the whim of troops who now saw the throne as something negotiable, not sacred. Yet even as political order frayed, Rome's culture glowed with melancholy beauty. Cities still flourished with art and learning. Architects repaired amphitheaters. Poets praised emperors they privately pitied. Philosophers debated virtue in marble courtyards even as corruption grew beneath them. The empire, as one writer said, was like an old oak, hollowed at the core, yet still vast in shade. In North Africa, Carthage and Leptis Magna prospered, feeding Rome's markets with grain and olive oil. In Gaul and Hispania, villas spread across fertile landscapes, mosaics gleaming in the sun. In the east, Antioch and Alexandria remained centers of wealth and scholarship, where Greek thought and Roman governance blended with Egyptian mysticism and Persian trade. But the unity of Rome, the invisible glue that had once held these worlds together, began to thin. Local elites grew more independent. Frontier generals wielded more power than governors. And ordinary citizens, once proud of Roman citizenship, now saw it as a burden of taxes and conscription. The empire was not falling yet, but it had begun to bend. Still, there were moments of renewal. Septimius Severus's son, Caracalla, would extend Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, a gesture that at once celebrated equality and quietly expanded the tax base. He built the Grand Baths of Caracalla, a monument to Rome's enduring love of public splendor. Massive halls of marble, echoing with the sound of running water, mosaics beneath the feet of ordinary citizens. To the visitor walking through those baths, Rome still felt infinite. But to those who governed, cracks were appearing in the marble. By the middle of the 3rd century, the empire's unity would fracture into chaos, usurpers, invasions, plagues, economic collapse. But that storm, that crisis of the 3rd century, was still to come. For now, Rome lingered in twilight, magnificent, weary, and unaware of how close the night had drawn. Decline, wrote one later historian, is rarely a single fall. It is the slow forgetting of why one ever rose. The 3rd century dawned not with ceremony, but with unease. The empire that had once stretched from the mist of Britannia to the sands of Arabia was still vast, still proud, yet fragile in ways unseen before. Its armies guarded too many frontiers. Its emperors wore crowns too heavy for one man to bear, and its citizens, from peasants in Gaul to traders in Egypt, began to wonder whether Rome still ruled or merely survived. After the death of Caracalla in 217 CE, the throne became a revolving door of soldiers and opportunists. Each new emperor promised restoration, peace, or reform, and each in turn fell to rebellion or assassination. Some ruled for years, others for months. One reigned for just 88 days. It was a time of restlessness, a storm that never ended, only shifted. The legions, once symbols of discipline, became power brokers. Generals in distant provinces raised their standards and proclaimed themselves emperor, supported by men whose loyalty was not to Rome itself, but to whoever paid them most. In these years, the frontiers broke like glass. From the north, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and the Danube, raiding towns and fortresses once thought invincible. In the east, the Sassanid Persians rose as a new and formidable power, sweeping through Mesopotamia and capturing Roman cities. In 260 CE, the Emperor Valerian himself was taken prisoner by the Persian king Shapur I, the first Roman emperor ever captured alive by a foreign enemy. Legends say Shapur used him as a human footstool to mount his horse. Whether true or not, the image burned itself into Roman memory, a symbol of humiliation unthinkable in earlier centuries. Meanwhile, the plague returned. The so-called Plague of Cyprian swept through the empire, killing millions, decimating armies, and emptying cities. Grain rotted in the fields, tax collectors found no one left to pay. In the countryside, abandoned villas crumbled into silence, their mosaics left to dust. The economy shuddered. Coinage was debased, silver replaced with base metal, its value melting away like trust itself. Inflation soared. Merchants turned to barter, soldiers demanded pay in kind. Even the empire's once mighty roads, those arteries of commerce and control, began to fade under neglect. It was chaos without end. Between 235 and 284 CE, more than 20 emperors would claim the purple, most dying by the sword. This was the crisis of the 3rd century, a century that would test whether Rome could still remember how to endure. Yet, even in these storms, there were lights that did not go out. In the east, a queen rose who would rival emperors, Zenobia of Palmyra. When Rome's power waned, she built her own. From her desert capital, She ruled Syria, Egypt, and much of the East, calling herself Queen of Kings. She governed with wisdom and ambition, claiming descent from Cleopatra, and for a moment it seemed a new empire might rise where Rome faltered. But Aurelian, one of the last great soldier emperors, would not allow it. He restored unity with a mix of force and mercy. He defeated Zenobia in battle, paraded her through Rome in golden chains, yet spared her life, a rare act in those times. He repaired walls, rebuilt cities, and earned the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. For a brief instant, the empire seemed whole again. But Aurelian too fell to betrayal, struck down by his own officers before his plans could heal the fractures. And so the empire drifted once more. Still, through all this, Rome did not die. It adapted. It changed shape, shedding what it could no longer sustain, clinging to what mattered most. This resilience, quiet and stubborn, became its truest strength. Amidst turmoil, new voices began to whisper of faith. Christianity, once a small and persecuted sect, began to spread through the empire's wounds. Its message, of endurance, of humility, of life beyond this world, found listeners among slaves, soldiers, and senators alike. It offered meaning in an age that seemed to have lost it. In the catacombs beneath Rome, believers gathered in the flickering light of oil lamps. They carved simple symbols on the walls, a fish, a dove, a cross, never imagining that centuries later, those same signs would crown basilicas across the empire. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, still watched from their temples, but fewer voices prayed to them now. Even the emperors who once claimed divinity seemed less like gods and more like men worn thin by the weight of empire. By mid-century, exhaustion gave way to reform. Emperors like Gallienus began to rebuild, separating military and civil authority, restoring some semblance of order. But the wounds were deep. The old unity, that sense of being one Rome, had faded. Still, there was one man yet to come who would restore more than stability. He would rebuild the empire itself. His name was Diocletian. When Diocletian took power in 284 CE, Rome had been broken by 50 years of chaos. But he was not a dreamer. He was a strategist. Where others sought to rule by tradition, he ruled by structure. He divided the empire into manageable halves, an Eastern and a Western Roman Empire, each ruled by its own Augustus and Junior Caesar. This tetrarchy, the rule of four, was his answer to the ungovernable vastness of Rome. He fortified borders, fixed prices, reformed taxation, and imposed order through law and fear. He demanded worship of the imperial genius once again, and unleashed the last greatest persecution of Christians, believing their faith a threat to unity. But even his severity could not outlast time. When Diocletian finally retired in 305 CE, retreating to his palace on the Adriatic coast, a vast, fortified villa that would one day become the city of Split, he left behind an empire that was strong again, but changed forever. No longer was Rome ruled from the Senate or the streets. It was ruled from distant palaces, by men who saw themselves less as citizens and more as emperors in a divine hierarchy. The old republic was a ghost, the old virtues a memory. And yet, Rome endured. We thought we had restored the world, one chronicler wrote, but it was no longer the same world we began to rule. As the 3rd century drew to its close, the empire had survived the unthinkable, but survival had come at a cost of freedom, of unity, of soul. The light that still burned was colder now, steadier perhaps, but distant, the light not of a living flame, but of embers that refused to die. And so, as night settled over the old empire, Rome turned its gaze east, toward Constantinople, toward a new dawn that was also the shadow of its end. When Diocletian withdrew to his palace by the sea, he left the empire divided, yet alive. Few men could claim to have saved Rome after such storms, and fewer still could retire from power. His palace at Split was not merely a home, it was a symbol of what Rome had become, a fortress of order, looking inward, its marble halls both beautiful and defensive. From here, he tended his gardens while others fought for what he had once ruled. But the world he left behind did not rest. The system he built, the tetrarchy, began to crumble almost as soon as he laid it down. Rival Caesars and Augusti turned against one another, each claiming the mantle of legitimacy. Armies marched, borders burned, and once again the fate of Rome would rest not in institutions, but in the hands of a single man. That man was Constantine. He was born in the late 270s, the son of a Roman officer and a woman named Helena. a figure who would one day be called a saint. Constantine grew up in the fading light of Diocletian's reforms, seeing both their discipline and their decay. He understood the empire's weariness and the yearning of its people for unity, for purpose, for faith. When his father, Constantius, died in the northern town of Eboracum, modern-day York, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops. The legions, loyal as ever to strength and charisma, lifted him upon their shields as the purple dawned anew. Yet his path to power would be written in both blood and vision. For years, civil war raged once more as Constantine fought rival emperors across Europe. But in 312 CE, on the eve of a decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge, something happened that would forever change Rome and history itself. As the story goes, Constantine looked to the sky and saw a sign, a cross of light shining above the sun, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." That night he ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, the Chi, two Greek letters that formed the name of Christ. The next day, he won. Rome belonged to him. Historians still debate what Constantine saw, whether it was vision, omen, or faith, but the consequence was clear. Christianity, once persecuted in catacombs, would now ascend to the palaces of power. When Constantine entered Rome, he did not offer sacrifices to Jupiter. Instead, he credited his victory to the Christian God. The following year, with his co-emperor Licinius, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting freedom of worship across the empire. It was the beginning of a transformation as profound as anything Rome had ever known. The temples of the old gods still stood, grand, silent witnesses to centuries of devotion, but new churches began to rise beside them. Basilicas dedicated to the apostles appeared where courts of justice once gathered. The language of empire, once Latin and law, began to merge with the language of faith, salvation, resurrection, eternity. For ordinary Romans, the change came slowly. The markets still opened, the aqueducts still flowed, and the legions still guarded the frontiers. But beneath that rhythm, something subtle shifted. Power no longer claimed to be divine, it claimed to serve the divine. Constantine himself was not a simple convert. He ruled as emperors always had, with ambition, vision, and the cold logic of survival. But he saw in Christianity a unifying force greater than any army, greater even than Rome itself. It offered what the empire had lost, a common faith that could bind East and West, slave and senator under one heaven. And so he built a new capital, not in Italy, but on the edge of Europe and Asia, a city that would carry his name and his dream, Constantinople. There, on the ancient site of Byzantium, he built a city of light and marble, New Rome, as he called it, adorned with forums, churches, and palaces. Its walls rose above the Bosporus, guarding both trade and faith, facing east toward the dawn. If old Rome was born of conquest, this new Rome was born of endurance, a phoenix rising from centuries of storm. By 330 CE, when Constantine dedicated the city, the empire had changed beyond recognition. The Senate remained, but it no longer ruled. The army obeyed, but no longer for gold alone. The emperor, once a god among men, now saw himself as God's instrument on earth. And yet, even as this last renewal blossomed, the old Rome endured, aging, proud, still magnificent. Its temples still caught the sun, its baths still echoed with laughter, its poets still wrote of heroes long dead. But the marble that once seemed eternal was beginning to crack. The Tiber's waters ran lower. Grass grew between the stones of neglected roads. The capital of the world was becoming a relic of its own greatness. Constantine ruled until 337 CE, and when he died, the empire once more divided among his sons, a fragile balance between ambition and faith. He was baptized on his deathbed, sealing his legacy not as the last pagan emperor, but as the first Christian one. After his death, the transformation he began only deepened. The old gods faded like forgotten constellations. By the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius would outlaw pagan worship entirely, closing temples that had stood for 1,000 years. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of Rome's eternal flame, were dismissed. The flame itself, the symbol of the city's spirit, was extinguished. And yet, perhaps it had not gone out. Perhaps it had simply changed form. From that same city would rise a new faith that carried the echoes of Roman order and endurance, the Church. Its bishops spoke in Latin, its rites borrowed the grandeur of Roman ceremony. Its hierarchy mirrored the empire itself. Rome, it seemed, had not died. It had merely transformed, from an empire of stone to an empire of souls. But even as faith blossomed, the old dangers returned. The frontiers trembled once more. Goths, Huns, Vandals, tribes long held back by Roman might, now pressing against the gates of a weary world. The Western Empire, drained of strength, would soon face the unthinkable. Still, in this moment, the age of Constantine and his successors, Rome shone again. For a final time, it dreamed of permanence. "The empire is reborn," wrote a poet of the age, "not in conquest but in faith. We are no longer masters of the earth, but pilgrims beneath one sky." And so the empire, renewed in spirit if not in strength, stood once more between past and future, its marble glowing in the sunset, its cathedrals echoing with the sound of prayers that would outlast the empire itself. The story of Rome was nearing its end, yet also its beginning, for the world it built would not vanish with its fall. Its laws, its language, its roads, and its dreams would ripple through the centuries, shaping kingdoms, republics, and empires yet unborn. "All things human pass," whispered an old saying, "but the name of Rome endures." Empires do not die in a single hour. They drift into memory, like ruins sinking into earth. By the middle of the 4th century, the Roman Empire was two worlds sharing one name. In the east, from Constantinople's shining domes, emperors ruled with wealth, learning, and stability. Trade flowed through the Aegean, scholars copied manuscripts, and the great walls rose higher every decade. But in the west, in Rome itself, in Gaul, in the misted frontiers of the Rhine and the Danube, the old world had begun to fade. The Western Empire still called itself eternal, still struck coins bearing proud Latin titles, still held games in the Colosseum. But its fields were emptying, its treasury thinning, and its armies no longer Roman in name or spirit. Most soldiers now were foreigners, Goths, Franks, Huns, mercenaries fighting for gold, not glory. They spoke other tongues, prayed to other gods, and owed their loyalty to their generals, not the empire. The frontiers that had once held firm were now lines in sand. Along the Rhine, whole tribes crossed unopposed, fleeing from the terror of the Huns. In Gaul, villages burned. In Britain, the legions had withdrawn, leaving towns to fend for themselves. And across the Alps, refugees began to pour south, hungry, desperate, and armed. Inside Rome, senators still met, cloaked in tradition. They spoke of honor and duty, but few remembered what those words had once demanded. The emperor himself, seated on a throne of ceremony, not command, ruled only in name. Real power lay in the generals who fought to hold together what little remained. In 376 CE, one such general made a decision that would echo through centuries. The Emperor Valens, ruling from Constantinople, allowed the Goths, a vast people fleeing the Huns, to cross the Danube and settle within the empire's borders. They came as refugees, weary and starving. But mismanagement, greed, and cruelty turned desperation into fury. Roman officials extorted them, selling rotten food for gold and even for the lives of their children. When revolt came, it came like fire. At Adrianople, in 378 CE, the Goths rose against Rome. The Roman army, proud, disciplined, the heir to centuries of conquest, was annihilated. The emperor himself was killed, his body never found. It was a catastrophe unseen since Cannae. The age of invincible legions was over. Rome staggered, and though the empire did not fall that day, something deeper broke, faith in its own invulnerability. For the first time, barbarians had not merely raided, they had defeated Rome within her own borders. The decades that followed were years of uneasy survival. Emperors came and went, many mere puppets of generals or foreign allies. Theodosius I, a devout Christian, managed to restore a fragile peace, and it was he who in 380 CE declared Christianity the empire's official faith. The temples of the old gods fell silent. The statues of Jupiter and Mars were toppled or quietly hidden in gardens. Rome's soul, once shaped by its pagan ancestors, now beat to the rhythm of church bells. When Theodosius died in 395 CE, his sons divided the empire for the last time. East and West, never again united under one ruler. The Eastern Empire would live on, strong and wealthy. The Western would face the storm alone. Soon after, that storm arrived. A man named Alaric, leader of the Visigoths, once served as a Roman officer. He knew Rome's strength and its weakness. When Rome failed to reward his loyalty, he turned his people's hunger into conquest. For years he marched through Greece and Italy, demanding recognition, food, and land. Each time, Rome stalled, promised, then betrayed. Until at last, Alaric had enough. In 410 CE, for the first time in 800 years, Rome was sacked. The unthinkable had happened. The city that had conquered the world was now plundered by those it once called barbarians. Temples were looted, palaces burned, treasures taken, yet even in this chaos, there was restraint. Churches were spared, and those who sought sanctuary were protected. The sack was not a slaughter, but a symbol, the end of illusion. When news spread across the empire, many refused to believe it. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, said, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" In every city, people whispered that the world itself was ending. To them, Rome was not just a city, it was civilization. Its fall felt like the fall of order itself. But even as ashes cooled, life went on. The city still stood, though wounded, and in its ruins a new world began to take shape. The emperors who followed could not restore what was lost. Power drifted to Ravenna, a city easier to defend, surrounded by marsh and sea. There, behind walls and silence, emperors signed decrees few obeyed, while generals fought endless wars against tribes they could neither conquer nor trust. Among these generals was one name history would remember, Stilicho, a man of mixed Roman and barbarian blood. He fought bravely to preserve the empire, winning battles even as the walls closed in. But the Senate distrusted him for his heritage. Accused of treason, he was executed, and with him, Rome lost perhaps its last true guardian. Without men like Stilicho, the Western Empire became a body without a pulse, moving by inertia, sustained by memory. New peoples carved kingdoms from its fading map. The Vandals seized North Africa and its grain fleets. The Visigoths settled in Gaul and Hispania. The Franks crept into the north, and across the Rhine, new nations began to rise upon the bones of empire. Yet in the midst of this ruin, something remarkable endured, Rome's spirit of order. Even barbarian kings adopted Roman titles, Roman laws, Roman coinage. They did not wish to destroy Rome, they wished to inherit it. "We are Romans now," one Gothic noble declared, "for who else remains?" By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire was a shadow of itself. Italy trembled beneath invasions, the Senate grew old and irrelevant. The last great general, Aetius, known as the last of the Romans, won one final victory against Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE. It was a triumph, a brief, blinding light before the dark. Rome had survived Attila, but not itself. Soon after, Aetius was murdered by the emperor he had saved, and the empire, leaderless and hollow, drifted toward its final night. "It was not thunder that destroyed us," wrote one Roman chronicler, "but the silence after it. All that is solid falls to dust, yet from dust memory blooms." The 5th century dawned over a weary world. The Western Empire was little more than a tapestry of fragile alliances. Provinces ruled in name but not in truth. From the Atlantic to the Alps, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Gaul, Roman banners still fluttered, but they hung over lands no longer truly Rome's. In Italy, the emperors of this final age were not leaders, but symbols. Pale reflections of a power that once moved mountains. Real authority lay with generals, often foreigners by birth, but Roman by ambition. They ruled not from the Senate, but from the sword. Among them was Flavius Aetius, called the last of the Romans. He was a man of both worlds, part Roman, part barbarian, raised among the Huns as a hostage in his youth. He understood the tribes that now pressed upon the empire's gates, and for a time he held them back. In 451 CE, he faced Attila the Hun, the scourge of God, as men called him, on the plains of Gaul. There, at the Battle of the Catalonian Fields, Rome's battered legions, allied with Visigoths and Franks, halted the seemingly unstoppable. It was not a victory of triumph, but of survival, a flicker of Rome's ancient flame. But fate, as ever, was cruel. 2 years later, the Emperor Valentinian III, paranoid and ungrateful, murdered Aetius with his own hand in the palace at Ravenna. A courtier whispered, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." Within a year, Valentinian was dead as well, cut down by the same guards who had once served Aetius. And with them, the last strong thread of Roman defense snapped. In 455 CE, the Vandals sailed from North Africa and reached Rome's shores. For the second time in less than half a century, the Eternal City was sacked. For 14 days, ships were filled with plunder, gold, silver, relics, art, the wealth of centuries carried away. Unlike Alaric's Goths, the Vandals showed little restraint. Even the great bronze roof of the Temple of Jupiter was torn down and melted for treasure. From that act, the very word vandalism would be born. And yet Rome still lived, bruised, hollow, but breathing. Churches replaced temples, bishops replaced senators. The center of gravity had shifted from power to faith. In the east, Constantinople flourished, strong walls, strong emperors, strong coin. In the west, Rome withered but did not die. Its name still commanded awe, even among those who had never seen it. To be Roman was still to stand for order, for law, for civilization itself. But the final act had already begun. A new general rose, Orestes, once a secretary to Attila himself. He placed his young son, Romulus Augustulus, upon the throne in 475 CE, a child emperor, the last to rule the West. The irony was almost poetic. The boy bore the name of Rome's first king and her first emperor, Romulus and Augustus, as though destiny itself had come full circle. But across the Alps, another man was marching, Odoacer, leader of Germanic troops long employed by the empire. He demanded land and recognition for his men. When Orestes refused, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, overthrew him, and deposed the boy emperor. It was the year 476 CE. The Western Roman Empire, that grand story of conquest, law, and civilization that had begun 1,000 years earlier, had ended. Yet it did not end with fire and fury. No cities burned, no temples collapsed, no final battle thundered. It ended quietly, a parchment signed, a crown set down, a child spared. Romulus Augustulus was not killed. He was sent into retirement, to live out his days in peace on a small estate by the sea. A boy who carried the last spark of the empire, fading into history. When news reached Constantinople, the Eastern Emperor received Odoacer's message. There was no longer a need for two emperors. The West no longer required its own ruler. The purple robe, the imperial insignia, and the crown were sent east, to the city that had once been Byzantium, now the new heart of Rome. And so, with one gesture, the Western Empire passed into memory. Rome has fallen, wrote the chroniclers, but her shadow stretches still. For the empire had built more than walls. It had built habits of thought, laws of justice, roads that outlasted its rulers. Even as kings replaced emperors, they ruled by Roman precedent. Even as Latin ceased to be spoken, it lived on in prayer and decree. Even as ruins rose from dust, their arches framed the dawn of a new world. The church carried forward the discipline Rome had once embodied. Its bishops became governors of souls, its cathedrals new forms of power. Monasteries copied books, preserving Cicero and Virgil beside the Gospels. And in the east, Byzantium carried the flame, Greek in speech, Christian in heart, Roman in law. The empire was gone, yet it endured, reborn in 1,000 hidden ways. In Italy, peasants still called the roads Via Romanae, Roman ways. In France, kings ruled from civitas, the Roman word for city. In Spain, the law still followed the Codex Theodosianus. And far to the north, in the forests of Germania and the mists of Britain, chieftains and monks alike looked back toward Rome as the measure of greatness. "We are all Romans," a scholar in Gaul once said, "for Rome is not a place, but an idea. It is an idea that outlived the legions, outlasted the marble, and whispered even through ruin." For though the Western Empire had fallen, its spirit had already taken new form, in language, in law, in faith, and in dream. And centuries later, when kings and emperors of Europe crowned themselves Holy Roman, they did so not to imitate a corpse, but to inherit a myth, the myth that Rome was eternal. The world had changed. The ancient gods were gone, the forums silent, the aqueducts dry. But the light that had begun on the Palatine Hill, the light of ambition, of order, of destiny, still flickered across the map of time. Rome was gone, and yet, in ways that mattered most, it had never left. "Even as stones fall," wrote Augustine, "the city of God endures." And so ended the empire that began with kings and roads and laws, not in conquest, but in transformation. It left behind not silence, but echoes. In every court of law, in every dome and column, in every word of Latin prayer, Rome had fallen, and yet the world it created had just begun. "Time carries away empires," wrote a poet, "but it cannot carry away meaning." For Rome, in the end, became meaning itself. A story that binds the human past to the human present, the idea that through order, art, and thought we can outlast the chaos that surrounds us. The Romans once called their city Urbs Aeterna, the eternal city. They believed its destiny was to endure forever. And in a way they were right, not in empire, not in armies or crowns, but in the persistence of the idea that civilization can be built and rebuilt from dust. Even now, when we walk through our cities, we live among their echoes. Our laws still bear Latin roots. Our calendars mark the months of their gods. Our words, justice, senate, forum, empire, all descend from theirs. And every time we raise a building, light a fire, or dream of a better world, we reach unknowingly toward the same horizon that once drew the Romans on. In that sense, Rome never fell. It simply changed form. From empire to memory, from marble to mind, it became part of us. We are the heirs of all that came before, wrote a historian centuries later, and the dream of Rome walks with us still. And so, as night falls on this long journey, from kings to consuls, from Caesars to saints, from empire to echo, we are left with a single quiet truth. All things end. But from their ending, new beginnings are born. Rome's story is our story. A reminder that no greatness is without cost, and no fall is without legacy. So let the arches stand, the ruins rest, and the stars look down upon the Tiber as they always have. For the city may sleep, but her spirit remains awake, in language, in law, in the rhythm of the human heart. Roma Aeterna, they once whispered, eternal Rome. And still across the centuries, the whisper remains. You have been listening to Calm History, the Roman series, Episode 7, The Fall That Wasn't the End. From the rise of kings on muddy hillsides to the glitter of marble and the silence of ruins, Rome's story reminds us that nothing truly vanishes, only transforms. The roads, the words, the ideas endure. And so, in a quiet way, does Rome. If you've enjoyed this journey, consider leaving a moment of calm, a like, a comment, a reflection of your own. It helps this series reach others who seek to dream, to learn, or simply to rest. Until next time, sleep well, dream of distant ages, and remember, all empires fade, but wisdom remains.